Today's episode is brought to you by elitefts.com. Founded in 1998 with the primary aim to live, learn, and pass on. Please help Elite FTS support this mission by smashing the like button, leaving a comment, sharing with a friend, and thinking of us for your training needs. If you can put it in a gym bag or load weights on it, Elite FTS has it.
What's going on? I'm Dave Tate. We are broadcasting from the middle of the Elite FTS weight room, where the underground still thrives and you're part of the crew. It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. America Health is a premium telehealth platform specializing in hormone optimization and preventative medicine. Are you looking to optimize your health in and out of the gym, improve recovery, sex drive, and quality of life? Have you tried speaking to your health professional about this and have gotten the cold shoulder, stereotyped, or just told as part of getting older? You just go to americahealth.com/table talk, and you can create your own lab, or you can take labs that we've had set up for them, which are based upon the same labs that I've been doing over the last 15 years. Or you can use their guided optimization. With this, they'll put you in touch with a patient care coordinator, which is actually pretty cool because you get to sit down and speak to somebody that can understand what you're looking for from hormone optimization and the preventative medicine standpoint. After that conversation, they'll determine which labs that you should and which tests you should have done, and then from there, get the labs done. They'll review those labs with you and put you in touch with one of their hormone optimization specialists that can determine which supplementation that you should use over the counter or prescription. americahealth.com/table talk. The discount code is Table Talk. Of Table Talk. Today my guest is Daniel DeBrocke. Daniel has been in the strength and conditioning industry as a coach for close to a decade, maybe even a little bit over a decade. He's written for Elite FTS. He's written basically for everybody that vets authors, and I should quote that for a lot of the publications, pretty much most of the publications that you've written for, articles just don't get posted. They get vetted, which means the content's good. Yesterday, actually, I was reacquainting myself with the content that you put out there. It was actually way better than what I actually thought to begin with. So it was real. Some of it's really, really good. So you guys should just Google him and look at the content that he has. Some of it is long form, which, sorry guys, you have to do the work sometimes, and is really, really, really good. So I highly suggest you look up the content that he's had out there. We have some topics today we're going to talk about. He's currently what is the position? It's top editor, managing editor.
So it's actually might be changing in the next little bit because I was hired on as a coach. They moved me to director of education curriculum. And then now essentially we're working to expand my role into kind of some other aspects of education. So the official title, I don't exactly know what they're going to do with it. Yeah. But I mean, basically I just get to learn more, do more stuff in education. So I'm happy.
All right. So basically, if I understand correctly, and from some of the podcasts I was listening to from you yesterday, is about a third of your time is spent staying up with the research, keeping connected with what's going on. And then the rest of your time is put into the application aspect and the education aspect.
So about 30% of my time is spent coaching.
Yeah.
And then the rest, is like application research.
Awesome.
And content creation stuff.
Yeah, that I think is the critical role there, is staying connected with what's coming out and then being able to apply it. Because the trajectory of most of you guys that come through here is you, and myself included, we all start with that. And then you get so freaking busy with all the other stuff that tends to fall a little bit. And as we'll speak throughout the podcast, not a whole lot changes either. So once you kind of like really get caught up with what's going on, it becomes a little bit easier to stay connected. But I think you still need to stay connected because trends change, right? So I don't want to say actual things change all that much, but the trends do. And when you're in your position with Kabuki, you have to know what trend to ride, what trend not to ride, because you guys are trying to stay with what's producing the greatest result for the athletes. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And from what I can tell, let me know from an outsider looking in, is you guys use a model to where your coaches can still maintain some of their individual freedom with how they train the athletes, and it's not brand focused. In other words, there's not like a Kabuki template. Here's what everybody has to follow.
Yeah.
It's what's best for the athlete.
Yeah, 100%. And so, I mean, probably very similar to, I guess, how you might work with other coaches and stuff like that. There are basic fundamentals like, hey, if you squat, it's probably a good idea to brace. You know what I mean? But in terms of how a lot of these things are implemented, that's where there's like a lot of creativity. And so I am a big fan of that because, you know, the moment you start pigeonholing yourself and saying like, this is how we do things, it kind of, if new evidence emerges, whether it's like anecdotal or research or however you want to frame evidence, it really makes it difficult to pivot because now you're sort of like ingrained in your stance. And so I like that everyone has the ability to coach in different ways. And when I talk with a lot of the other coaches there, everyone's very different in how we apply things. Like some people really utilize like, you know, VBT and all the velocity stuff. Other people are like major nerds into programming. Other people really focus on like the client-centric approach, you know, or whatever it is. But everyone has their own strengths. And so it's really cool because we get to talk to each other. We get to learn from each other. We get to build up our own essentially toolbox by sort of feeding off the strengths of all the other people. So it's really interesting in that way.
I think it's vital in this industry because I've been in it forever, right? So when I've been in it forever, I've seen exactly what you're talking about. I see people pigeonholing themselves before they even know they're doing it. And I'll see what they're doing and kind of how they're positioning themselves. And then I'm thinking, oh, now 5 years from now, you're going to have some problems.
Right.
You know, or you're going to have some problems if everything kind of comes circular, right? Even the stupid shit comes back at a certain point in time. But some things, such as bracing and things like that, were, I don't want to say always known. They were always important, but the way they were being described and taught were a given. Right? So, say in Ed Cohn's time, people will say, oh, no, Ed never braced. I guess he did. He just didn't know it was called bracing, right? Where when I was going through Westside, it was, you know, fill your stomach out and push it against your belt. Terrible fucking cue today, right? But worked for everybody there, which essentially ended up being, you know, the bracing. It's just the changing of, not the changing, the ability to describe what to do has gotten way better over the last 30 years that I've been around this in a big way. Rightfully so. And I think that's where the internet's actually helped. You know, people are like, internet's evil. It's both. Because if the example I like to use is when I first started doing seminars forever ago, we were teaching, you know, arch your back really hard when you squat, which works really well when you're a thick power lifter and you really can't because your erectors are 2 liters. What you're really doing is keeping your back super tight. You're keeping your lats tight. Right. But the cue, right, through all my age was that. But then when you start to, when I used to see, and I go to a seminar to teach this, and I'd see people like with this, like, what the hell are you doing? Doing what you said to do. No, that's not what I said. Well, here, right here, it says right here. I'm like, oh shit, you know. And that's what I think from my perspective, what I've seen is the biggest change, and that's also where I see people making the biggest mistakes today. Is they'll use something like that, like a cue, then they're willing to die on that hill, and it's being misinterpreted in the first place.
Yeah, so cueing is kind of a funny one. So a perfect example of what you're talking about, I mean, is I think that when you get social media and the internet, you get this massive explosion of content of different individuals coming in, sharing their own experiences, sharing their interpretation of something. And so when you have 80 different people, I mean, it's way more than 80 people, but you know, when you have a significant number of people who are all talking about the same thing, you're going to get slight variations. And even with cueing, you might be saying the exact same thing as the next person, but for some reason, the way they say it just clicks. The fundamental principles of what you're saying is the exact same. But then, so I think that's been really good, and it's allowed people an avenue to really explore these ideas and think about them deeply and be able to communicate them really effectively, because now there's so many mediums. Before it was like books, seminars, that's it. You know, maybe like a mailer magazine or something like that.
Yeah.
But now you have like TikTok, you have YouTube, you have long form articles, short form articles, you've got Instagram, Facebook, and just anything in between. And so there's just like I guess the turnaround time is just so much faster. And it was funny actually, because I literally made a post about cueing the other day, because I've heard like exercise physiologists talk about this. And this is an actual example that I heard from a legitimate exercise physiologist. And I'm not calling this specific person out, because they are like very, very smart, have crazy content I love. But every now and then I think they kind of go outside of their capabilities a little bit. And so, you know, he was like, I don't know why people are saying breathe into your belly. Your lungs aren't in your belly. And I'm like, do you not understand what a cue is? You know, like they don't have to be accurate. I've literally told an athlete in competition to focus on like chest down, like you're doing a sit-up, and push your butt back. If you're taking that literally, I'm the worst coach ever, right? But it put this person in a great position. Like you said, put them in a neutral spine position, because they were arching instead of kind of loading their hips. And then all of a sudden, their squat looks fucking fantastic. And so, sorry, can I swear?
Oh, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I just know they have like the 5-minute mark on YouTube or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, it's like the whole point of cueing is just getting that information to disseminate, and so the other person can understand it and apply it.
Yeah, and I've seen the same things where when I have people out for small clinics that I'll do, and if we're recording it, you know, I always have to, now I make a point. It's like, look, guys, you need to understand this is what I'm cueing for this person at this time, because it's working. It may sound terrible. You know, sometimes I may be telling people, put all your weight on your toes. And like, what the hell, you know, if they're squatting, like, because they're all the weights on, you know, you're trying to find that balance in there.
Yeah.
And when it's working with individuals on that case-by-case basis, you have to do what's going to connect first, and then kind of explain what you're actually doing later. When it's educational content, that becomes hard, right? Because with the educational content, a lot of stuff that you guys will put out, you want to explain exactly what everything's going on is supposed to be. And that, some people will try to replicate, and is what they should do, but then they screw up. You know, and you know this because you do clinics, right? So you kind of see that nuance that you're talking about. But the tricky part is if somebody films one of those clinics, you know what I'm saying? And then you're telling somebody something, they'll be like, oh man, that's not what you said over here. Well, that was a demonstration video that's not cueing, but instructing.
Yeah, I think a lot of the times it's context, you know? And so like someone might hear you say something and they don't understand. Actually, a great example is I heard you say something on, so when I was lifting during COVID, I'd go to my buddy's house because everything was shut down. So we just lift in his garage gym, and he had a TV in there, and we'd always put on the Table Talk podcast or just any like Elite FTS videos just in general. And there were a handful of things that I remember that we would just kind of watch, and there was something that I saw you say, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was something that I heard you say, which when I heard it like years and years ago, I was like, I don't get it. And then I heard you make a comment, but it's like the way you phrase this one thing, there was so much depth behind it that I was like, oh, I understand what he's saying now, you know? And it's really hard to do that sometimes when you're trying to communicate something in a 90-second reel or if you know it's going to be like on there, because you're like, okay, I have to try and give something I have to relay information in as accurate a way as I can. And this is going to be the best possible way and minimize misinterpretations. But then when you actually, like you said, when you actually sit down with someone, you know, what someone feels like, let's say if we're talking about like your balance on your feet, right? So are you too far on your heels? Are you too far on your toes? Maybe someone feels like they're too far on their heels, so they're trying to shift more to their toes, but they're already really far into the forefoot.
Good point.
You know? And so it's like, you know, even if they're implementing the strategy, they might be doing it incorrectly because they're not necessarily aware of what's actually going on in their body. So there's like, I don't know, you're never going to please anyone.
No, not online, right? No, I mean, the best we can do is put the content out. And I do think that there's an overabundance of content. I'm not going to disagree with that. But I also think that it's pretty easy to find the crap that's just not good. You know, I think we get caught in the nuance of a lot of the content because we're trying to compare the top 20% of the best content to find what the biggest differences are between there. And other people do it too. And we all seem to forget that if you were just a newbie or just a beginner and you just search strength and conditioning, just do it sometime. And then you see there's so much very general crap. It's almost as bad as the nutrition diet field. It's like, okay, most people, right, except for Gen Pop that have no idea, most people should be able to, okay, this is crap, and then be able to, find the other one. So I don't actually think the overabundance is a problem. For Gen Pop, that's a different discussion. It would definitely be a problem than there. But for people who take this seriously, I think if they spent more time trying to find what's common amongst what everybody's saying, they would be so far ahead instead of trying to look at what the differences are and what everybody's saying. Because the basics of programming are still the basics of programming, where you have down here as a topic a needs analysis, right? That's where all the basics start, right?
Yeah. I think that's a really great point. I've never really thought of it in that way, but I think that's actually a fantastic recommendation because, people will talk about Westside or Sheiko or whatever, like the more popularized, systems of training. And they'll always be like, oh, well, this is better because blah, blah, blah. And this is better because blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, well, do both have an insane amount of, top level athletes? Do both have an insane amount of, recognition for, hey, this works really, really well? So it's like, regardless of what approach, whether it's like I don't even remember all of them, but it's like the Cube method, the Juggernaut method, Westside, it doesn't even matter. It's like they all work and they all work for the same reasons. And so it's
let's
like,
do this.
Why is that?
This will be this will be a fun exercise. Let's do this. Let's take Sheiko and Westside because they're polar opposites.
Yeah, exactly.
And let's talk about what's common amongst those two.
Yeah.
Right? So the first common thing would be, contrary to what people think, Westside does have a phasic structure, right? So they both have a phasic structure associated with them. So that's a commonality, right?
Yeah.
They both squat, bench, and deadlift. That's commonality. Specificity to different degrees is a commonality. You're not, in Westside, you're not doing leg presses instead of squats, on those days.
Yeah.
Continue,
Yeah, well, I mean, the specificity one I think is the really important one because people will look at specificity just through a pretty narrow lens, but it's like, okay, loading potential, that's part of specificity. Exercise selection is part of specificity. Exercise variety, you look at volume allocation, you look at all of these things, they're all part of specificity. And just because something's more specific in one area doesn't mean it's less specific in another area. So for instance, a great example of this might be, you might add a second squat day, but if you do low bar squats on that day, it's going to increase fatigue beyond a point where it's actually productive. And you're not necessarily going to be training, let's say you wanted to bias your quads. You might choose a less specific exercise like a front squat to bias your quads more, or a belt squat even, which is way less specific. But you lose specificity over here to gain it over here because it's going to support your base, which is going to increase output down the road. So it's like, it's not like this on-off switch that people think it is. It's like, this big, broad spectrum of multiple variables you can kind of look at. I think another thing they do a really good job with is the volume. So like Sheiko's known for like tons and tons of volume, but so is Westside, and like both guys focus on like building a good base of muscle, which is funny because a lot of powerlifters just kind of neglect the muscular base, especially because now, I think back in the day, people would go the route of powerlifting through bodybuilding, whereas now people just kind of see powerlifting and then they just jump in.
Yeah.
And so you get these guys who are like, small frame. I mean, like myself, right? Like when I first started, I was like super, super skinny and I just started into strength training. But I mean, I also wanted to be like jacked. And so I just ate until I got up to like 280, 290 eventually, which probably wasn't the best way to do it. But, I think a lot of people don't necessarily have that same mentality about like, hey, I need to put on some more tissue.
Yeah. The other commonality I would see and this is just, I mean, we're just going off the cup here. It's not like we're prepared for this, is the emphasis on technical aspects. You know,
100%.
You know, which is a big one. So it's, I think if more people took the time, you know, at a deeper level than what we're talking about here, what's the same, but then if they took that, and then whatever they're doing for themselves or whatever the coach they're working with, whatever, you know, however they're putting their program together, looked at their stuff to see if the same boxes were checked, they'd be far better off. Because a lot of the check boxes, the basic ones, when I'll speak to people, I'm surprised at how many times some of the basic ones are like, what are you talking about? Like, well, you have to be able to recover from your training. You know, and they're like, oh, this is like a conversation. Like it shouldn't be a conversation. It should be like a known thing that if you can't recover from what you're doing, then either you need to change the recovery modality, change the lifestyle, or change what you're doing, and something has to change. Right. You can't just keep doing it and then assume it's going to catch up. It's kind of like the anabolic, you know, modality. It's like, okay, you know, the drugs are going to kick in at some point. It's like, dude, it's been 6 weeks. You're still missing, you know, you're still missing reps. You know, I don't know exactly what you're waiting for, but it doesn't work like that.
Yeah. Well, actually, so there was you probably have better insight than I would on this, but there is a video on YouTube actually of Sheiko visiting Westside when Louis was there, and they were talking and like, I remember that, I don't know if it was in the video or an interview at another point that I heard this, but he was talking about like, hey, who are the best coaches? And one of the people he said was like Louis Simmons. And it's like, okay, if they're diametrically opposite, why is he saying that he's one of the best coaches in the world? Yeah. You know, it's like, there's got to be something there, you know? So, do you know which video I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. And I know of that conversation. I know that meeting, and I talked to Louis about it, you know, afterwards, and everything that I know about it is secondhand, you know, so I need to put that out there, right? Yeah. Where one of the things that I was told is that he was told by Boris that if he had all this stuff that Louis had, yes, 100% he would use it, but he doesn't have access to it. So he has to go with what he has, where that's a big, you know, that's a big, bold statement. That's why I put the context in front of it, because I'm not too sure what I think about that. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to say it's bullshit or made up or anything like that. It might be loosely, you know, the translation might have been loosely, you know, interpreted, but because that goes almost, that's kind of almost like saying that the whole thing that he's doing would change. And
yeah, I mean,
but there were so many things that were agreed upon, you know, in exchanges, that I do know a couple people that were there, and I wish I was. And that was, I think that's the respect of two different, there's many ways to get to a certain spot. We all know that. So if you get coaches that have respect for the work that somebody else has done, and they've both have put people at that spot, you can't really sit there and say this doesn't work. Yeah. It's fucking ridiculous. Like, yes, it does. You just don't like the way it does. But that works, and so does this, and so does this, and so does this, and so does this. So I think it was probably more of that.
Yeah, so actually I did hear the comment that you just said. When I heard that, I guess I had a bit of a different perspective on that. I was more so thinking because of practical limitations, because like when I was in Serbia, and like if you go to a lot of those places, like they don't like gym. It's not like that over there, you know. So they don't have all this equipment. They've got rusty barbells. They've got shitty like those little 90s squat racks that look like they're going to collapse if you put 100 pounds on them. So that was my interpretation of that, where it was just like they just don't have a lot of that equipment over there. But again, maybe that's right, maybe it's wrong. I don't know. But that's
either
kind of
way. I think the biggest takeaway with that whole thing is you can still get super strong with very limited equipment. Yeah. And resources, right? Sometimes now how you do it might have to change. Maybe it does have to be higher frequency. Yeah. Because there isn't things there where, you know, that's two different rabbit holes to be able to go down with that as well.
Yeah. The funny thing about that too is like, I'll hear people say like, this exercise is not good for doing that, or I don't like this exercise because of this, or an approach, or whatever, you know? And a lot of the times I'm like, I think they're right, you know, but when you look into, you know, so for instance, I'll give an example, deficit sumo deadlifts. I know a lot of people hate on them. I know some people really like them. I've used like, you know, small deficits for sumo for a handful of my athletes, and they're like top tier sumo deadlifters, right? And I really like it for helping them wedge into position because they have to wedge so much harder. I've also heard an alternate argument. I don't like it because it changes your position a little too much, and so it's not quite as similar. And I think both are absolutely valid. But I also think that when you're looking at a lot of those preferences, that's exactly what they are. They're personal preferences based on that coach's aptitude and how they're able to get their athletes to a certain point. So like you said, maybe if you're trying to improve someone's bottom position in a sumo pull, maybe you're going to use, you know, pause deadlift. But maybe this person uses deficit deadlift, and the way that they coach it and then how they do everything else in the back end of their program or in the front end of their program accommodates for that. And so it allows them to get this great result by using this. But you're like, nah, I don't like doing that because it doesn't work for me. And so you do it this way. But it's like, is that because that's wrong, or is that because you just have a really good aptitude for doing things this way?
I think there's several things to that, because when I hear things like that, and say with the example you're talking about, it's going to mess up their technique because it's not specific enough. Well, how long is it being done for? Right? Mm-hmm. It's probably not even being done long enough to even have an impact on that. Right. You know, it's a 3-week phase or whatever it's going to be. And then B, what's the alternative? Right? And then C, can the coach teach the alternative better than what they can teach what they're doing?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
There's a big factor that's always assumed. Well, if they did pause deadlifts instead, but the coach has never taught a pause deadlift, isn't efficient at teaching the pause deadlift, the success of that's going to be horrible. Mm-hmm. You know, where they know the other one. They've been doing it for 5-10 years. It's dialed in. They know what to look for. They know what breaks down. They know what to cue. That plays into it as well. So with a lot of these, I wish some of these things would actually become more discussions instead of one comment debates, because you would see, you know, why the person is actually selecting that. And sometimes it's not for the reason that is interpreted in the first place.
Yeah. So a great example of that actually was, I was doing Jefferson curls. I used to, every now and then I'll throw in Jefferson curls for like a block or something like that. I really like doing them. And I do them in a very particular way. So I do them off like 8 to 10 inch deficit. So really, really high. And then I actually have the bar really far in front of me. And then I'll kind of like pull it in as I'm coming up, because otherwise I couldn't, like the bar just wouldn't even touch the floor. And so I'll do it like that, and it looks kind of weird. And someone's like, oh, like, why are you doing it like this? Is it because of A, B, and C mechanisms? And I was like, actually, I just noticed that when I do it, my hips get really strong and my back feels great. And I'm only doing it, like pulling it out like that, not to get more like, you know, quote unquote tension on my lats. I'm doing it just because if I put it down, it's going to crush my feet.
Yeah.
Because I'm using a huge block. I was like, that's it. There's no fancy reason for it. It's just a workaround. And so a lot of those differences, like you were mentioning, your example was so good about the pause deadlifts versus the other one, where it's like, okay, well, can he coach the alternative? Is he good at that? But those are all practical reasons for why something is going to be better than the other. It's not, you know, the mechanism involved or the specific tactic or tool. It's just a practical reason why an individual is choosing one modality over another, or one system over another. And so you're right. A lot of that stuff's not necessarily talked about. It'll just be like, this is the blank way, and it'll kind of be branded. And I mean, it's sexier and it's good for business, but then it's kind of like,
Well, that's another conversation there, though.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Because that becomes what's being put out there from a positioning standpoint to an education standpoint.
Right.
And I can probably make a broad statement that most of the stuff that you're going to see on short form social media is being put out for a positioning statement, marketing more or less.
Yeah.
And for the educational content, you're most likely either going to have to go into longer form or articles or on somebody's website, right? Because it's going to be edited, vetted, and controlled, you know, more so than just being thrown out there.
Right.
Where I don't know if it will always be that case, because I've seen 25 years of content and how it changes and migrates and moves.
Yeah.
And it does always move, but some principles always stay the same. You know, the cream will always rise to the crop, or whatever you get what I'm saying.
To the top,
to the top.
exactly.
And whatever's the best is never going to be the most popular.
Yeah.
It's just fact. You know, it's...
Yeah. Well, that's like, I don't know if you've been seeing any of these discussions around like, you know, biomechanics has kind of become this new, really popular discussion, especially in like the bodybuilding world, where I'll hear people talking about how pull-ups are not great for training your back, you know, or your lats, or the bench press is a shitty way to train your pecs. And I'm like, okay, what the fuck happened with Arnold then? You know what I mean? Like, it's like and the funny thing is, it's hilarious when you hear this, because you hear rationale. And the thing is, the rationale that's often put forward for that, that's correct. But the extrapolation of it is just too far.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about that is, when you look, you're like, okay, this only became popular about a year and a half ago. Where the fuck did your pecs come from?
Yeah.
Where'd this guy's pecs come from? Where'd all their pecs come from? It's like bench press. Yes, they're doing other variations, but at the same time, it's like, you're going to tell me that like all of the massive bodybuilders didn't put a ton of muscle on specifically from the bench press? Maybe they're not doing it anymore, but they built their base that way. Almost all of them. And so it's just like, why are we throwing away these exercises just because like you learn some fancy new biomechanics and are misunderstanding like the basic tenets of what's actually going on?
Positioning.
Yeah.
You know,
it's just like...
It's I'm laughing inside as you're saying this, because, you know, bodybuilding used to always kind of float from high volume and then low volume, right?
Yeah.
So it would go from like Arnold type training, you know, 20, 30 sets per body part, you know, then it would go into some type of HIIT training modality, you know, DC training, HIIT training, whatever was going to be, and then it would, that would go, then they go back here. And it was always interesting to sit there and watch, because it'd be like, oh my God, this is the greatest thing in the world. It's like, no, you just instituted change in a program that you haven't changed for 3 years. So you're going to have a different response, because it's just a different stimulus. And then I've been waiting for the low volume, high intensity to come back. And as I've been waiting for this, it went into this physical therapy thing. And that was like 5 years ago. And it was all physical therapy based, like correction, functional, all this other kind of shit. And I'm like, okay, once we get through here, then the high intensity is gonna come back. And that fucking goes into biomechanics, right? And it's like, instead of it, now there's other layers, you know, to this circle that's gonna keep going through, and it will play out over 2-3 years is normally, unless it's a really shitty one. Like exercises play out 3-4 months. Like finally, thank God, we're away from the one arm lat pull down in a kneeling position, right? I mean and I'm not saying, you know, I'm not saying any of these don't have application. They do, but anybody that follows this sees it. It's like, okay, there it is, there it is, there it is. Everybody's freaking doing it. It's like, oh my God, when's this going to be over? And they don't see how funny it is to me, because it's going to go away. It's just as fast as it came in. What's next? You know, but exercises rotate faster than, can we say philosophies? Because it's not even that.
I don't even think philosophy's really making the circle, unfortunately. Like that's like, you got to get real deep in there to start talking about like a first principles approach to training.
Wherein this, interesting enough, we don't see it as much in the strength sector. The body sector has these big white, you know, vast trends that kind of overshadow it. And the strengths, there still happens, but it's with accessory type stuff. It's not the whole thing. Like, you know what?
Yeah.
You know, and it could be just because, God, I've never really thought about this. So I'm thinking out loud. Bodybuilding's all accessories for us. So those movements probably make their way, you know, like this biomechanic thing most definitely is going to make its way into strength training, right? And then it would just fall into the accessory part of strength training.
Yeah, I mean, even just from like because you were talking about high volume versus low volume, high intensity, and I mean, like that stuff you can play around with a lot more with your sort of supplementary lifts or like accessory lifts than you can a squat. Like you go out there and you start doing like your conventional deadlift, and you're like, okay, now I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do compensatory acceleration training, and then I'm going to do high intensity, and it's just like, you're just going to blow up. Whereas like you can go to failure on a lat pull down, you can go to failure on leg extension. It's like, yeah, it's going to fuck you up, but it's not that bad.
Yeah, that brings up something that things I've said in the past that people don't really get what I'm saying. You know, what I was saying with that is the bodybuilding training from a programming standpoint is pretty easy. It's not that complicated.
It is, yeah.
Where the application of doing it is not. Like there's a lot more to it. There's a nutritional aspect. There's a lot more that goes into hypertrophy, building muscle, but there's a lot more room for error. Where when you're dealing with strength, you know, peaking for a powerlifting meet, peaking for a strongman, even peaking for Olympic weightlifting, there's some room for error, but not a lot. You can't just, you get what I'm saying with that. And that kind of came back to bite me a couple of times throughout the years, because they'd be like, oh, you're saying that bodybuilding is easy. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. I can make the argument it's actually harder.
Yeah.
You know, because the commitment, you know, you're dieting down right now. I mean, the commitment is 24/7. You don't have to have that really same level.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, the one thing that I've noticed, just gaining more exposure, just being more out there, even just like on the Kabuki page or articles or being invited on podcasts or whatever, is like, people are just going to hear what they want to hear. Like the number of times that I've been told what I mean about something, I'm like, oh, okay. All right. Like, so, and yeah, so someone will just say, oh, well, this is what you said. And I'm like, yeah, no, I know. And like, if you read it, if you actually take the literal interpretation of exactly what I said, it's exactly what I just explained right now. And they're like, well, my interpretation was this. And I'm like, cool. So I'm the speaker and I'm saying that it means this. So I can take ownership and say, hey, maybe I didn't communicate it as effectively as I should have, you know, because sometimes that happens, especially from social media. It's like, you know, but then beyond that, it's like, they just won't accept it. You know, like, I'm like, okay, well, if that was the case, then I would say that I misspoke and this is what I meant. But then that's not enough. They're like, no, you need to be punished. You need to be like, you know, admit that you're, and I'm just like, what do you, like, you just want to hear whatever you want to hear. Like, it doesn't matter what I say. You're just in this for like a fight or something like that.
Well, one thing you've done a phenomenal job of, and I don't know if it was intentional or not, is you can take some of your broad stroke philosophies on nutrition, psychology, and stuff like that, and you have long form article about it. You can even, if you look enough, you can even find some short form Instagram posts, micro blogs about it, and podcasts about it. So there's 3 different ways to be able to digest and absorb that same content, which is phenomenal if you think about it, because some people won't want to read, you know, a very long form article. So you can then say, well, here, listen to this. And then they have that, you know, or the shorter thing. So when it's one of the broader things and they're making comments like what you're talking about, what goes through my mind is, so they've actually done absolutely zero digging into what was really meant by that.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think people are just going to kind of do their own things, because like everyone who's doing really well doesn't tend to really tear other people down. Like, that's not really, you know, like there are some people who kind of make their business on like shitting on other people. You know, they'll make a video being like, here's why you're an idiot. And it's like, it is what it is. That's their thing. It's not really my prerogative. But I think the vast majority of people who are in this had a lot of people help them out and had a lot of people, you know, guide them in another direction when they were wrong. And so I think most people generally have that same sort of desire to kind of like, you know, live, learn, pass on, like you guys are doing, where it's like, I'm going to help other people. Because I know I've made a post. I think there were 2 times where I made a post about something. One was talking about IQ, and I was talking about the immutability of IQ. And Greg Knuckles sends me a private message. He's like, hey, bro, you know, I just saw your post on this, blah, blah. He's like, are you open to reading an article? Which is just a very nice way of saying like, hey, I think you're wrong. You should probably check this out. So I was like, oh, okay. So I read it. But it's like, that's how people will typically correct. They'll do it in private. So it's like you can kind of save face. But then he was also asking. You know, he wasn't like, you're wrong for these reasons. He's like, hey, would you be open to learning something new about IQ? And it's like, those people are never going to be the ones who are shitting on you on your Instagram post. Or if you say something wrong, it's like, It's always just the people, you go and you click on their pages, they call you skinny, or they call you this, they call you that, and then you go and click on their page, and it's like they don't have a face, they've got 0 posts, and they'll have like a Bible verse in their intro caption or some bullshit. All right, whatever, bro. Like,
no, I've experienced the same thing many times. The way you're talking about, and that's how we learn too, because sometimes the way it was presented wasn't exactly the way that you wanted to present it either. It was thinking one way, but it was interpreted a different way. And that, like you said, they don't publicly shit on you because they've been in the same place, and had the same things, or there could be something that was missed, with that. Sometimes not, but at least it opens dialogue, which is going to help, which is a great thing.
Yeah, and I mean, like, who's going out there trying to give out shitty information, trying to hurt people? It's like, are there people out there? Like, maybe, but like, who's doing that? So it's like, if you see someone and they're giving out bad information or something like that, then it's like, okay, you can maybe hit them up privately and because realistically, like, I'll see these posts where someone's like, talking about starvation mode. And then there's a guy doing like the green screen. He's like, no, idiot, it's because blah, blah, blah. And it's like, okay, cool, that's fine. But I remember when I was first starting out as coach, I heard that starvation mode thing. I used to talk about that. I used to believe that. What would have happened? Like, what would have happened if Instagram was around back then? Or maybe it was. I don't know. I wasn't on Instagram anyways. But what would have happened if I made a video, posted on Instagram, and then some guy with millions of followers made a video about me, like shitting on me? I'd be like, fuck, I'm not doing that again.
Yeah.
That's terrible, And so it's like, like, just help them.
That's one thing. I think the other part of this is, I've never, to the best of my knowledge, have never called anybody out by name, but I'll call ideas out if need be.
Exactly.
And even with that, if something like was really bothering me for some stupid reason, which it hasn't in like the past 5 years, so it's been a while, I would normally just make a note about it and then put it 2 months further down the road. And like, if this is still important, then write an article that's counter to what this is. Because I never wanted to make it look like I just wrote something that was a rebuttal to what somebody just posted. Because I didn't want them to even know they had the power that even affected me in one place.
Right. Yeah.
Then I could push it off. And then that gives it time. Like, is this really even important? Because most of the time it's not. And now there's some ideas that definitely need challenged because they get better. Some of the older things and are just there's misconceptions that probably need challenged, because most of the time it's a misconception where people are going to be like, oh shit, I didn't think about it like that.
Right.
It probably needs to be framed a little bit differently. So that's a big one, is the people, and getting into what you were saying with, people who call people out. It's during that whole Liver King thing. One of the funniest things to me was opening YouTube, because there was a reaction video to so-and-so's reaction of so-and-so's reaction of so-and-so's reaction that was of Liver King's reaction of this reaction. I'm like, the title can only have so many layers deep.
Yeah. And it's like 8 deviations away from the original.
Like, what the hell? Like, this is ridiculous.
It's so funny, actually, because I actually saw you say something like that about talking about Louis. Like, I know you waited a long time before talking about Louis, and it's not something I want to go into or anything like that, because obviously it's very private. But that was something I noticed, and I thought was really interesting, because that's literally the exact opposite of what most people will do. When something happens, they'll try and use that to capitalize on it, to get more clicks, to get more traffic through their own website, to get more awareness. And I think that is something that's like really popular, like Liver King, exactly like you said. It just blew up. And the funny thing too was that all that people are doing is they're helping him. Like, everyone's like, oh, Liver King's done. I'm like, no, this is probably the best thing that's ever happened to him, because everyone knows who he is. Everyone. Look at like that Andrew Tate guy. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you like him or you hate him or anything. You get like, everyone shares him. The people who like him share him. The people who hate him share him. Everyone's sharing him and talking about him. So if you don't know who he is, then you're gonna be like, oh, who's this Liver King guy? And then you go and you search him up and you're like, oh, he's jacked. And maybe you like him, maybe you don't, but everyone knows who he is. And he's got insane brand recognition now, specifically because of that.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the whole, like, their intention is to shut him down. But it's like, is it really? Because if it was, you wouldn't be talking about him.
No, hell no.
So, yeah, exactly. So it's actually really cool that you do that because...
I've always seen it as just the way I was raised is respect.
Yeah.
You know, I never want to be perceived if I've lost too many people in my life. I never want to be perceived as trying to monetize, you know, on somebody that was close to me.
100%.
It's like, this is no, you know, and plus it's not an easy topic to talk about when it's close. And people who are, this is the other way I look at it, people who are really close to him, or even John when he passed, people who are really close to him, potentially his kids, are watching, you know, everything that's going on out there. And it's like, man, you know, this is not the right time, you know, for this, but everybody else will jump all on it. And I get it. It's an attention economy, you know, but it's not respectful, you know, even if it's a freaking enemy, it's still not respectful. And that's how I see it. Now, some other people will see it, you know, differently, but there's a time and a place, and it's just, it's just a different, you know.
Right. And yeah, so I apologize for
No. I'll talk about all that because Louis had a huge impact. You know, I mean, we've had, you know, disagreements, we've had arguments. There's a whole fucking knew him forever. You know? So there's good and bad, and you know, he's an interesting, you know, person to communicate with and to get along with. And anybody who knows him will say that, who really knows him, because it's just he is a complex person to explain. Unless you knew him, then it's easy, because then it's a simple conversation to be able to have, you know. But the difference that he made in this industry is huge, you know, and nobody's ever going to deny that, you know. And some of the things that I've seen over the years, and some of them I'm probably responsible for because I was putting most of the stuff online before he was a misinterpretation of what was really being done. You know, like when, and I get it, because when I go back and look at the content, I see the gaps where the phasic structure was one of the bigger ones. You know, it's like, oh shit, what are you talking about? You know, the last deadlift was 3 weeks before the meet, the last squat was 2 weeks, the last bench was a week. That's kind of like a 3-week phase. I guess you could call that a peaking phase, and then before that's a circummax phase, and then before that's, then in the off season you didn't want your strength to go lower than 90%, but you expected it was going to drop. These are all phasic structures, but I see in there when statements are made, we're always 4 weeks ready for a meet. I get it. You know, you can see the disconnect with a lot of those things. The specificity is another one. You know, a lot of the max effort stuff falls outside of specificity. It's like, like you said earlier, to what degree? Yeah. You know, because the time under tension is within the range that we're looking about, you know, and a lot of these movements were very mechanically similar, you know, as well. And now, you know, as research at one point, you know, the consensus was it has to be exactly the same thing. Then it started to go certain deviations away from that certain thing, to where now it kind of fits, you know, kind of what was in there. And there's still gaps, you know, that were there. But that's the beauty of having more voices in the conversation, you know. And I think that's what people miss today that are putting content out, is they don't want to hear the voices that may be condescending, that are the private ones that you're talking about, because those are the most important ones, to be honest, because they're taking their time. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? To send you a message, and I don't believe it's out of hate. You know, the ones out of hate and spite and all the other kind of crap are the ones that are in the comments. The other ones are like, this is a learning, you know, this is a learning opportunity here. Maybe I should carve out some time to kind of look at what this is and see what that perspective is. And a lot of people, I don't think, do that.
I mean, it's hard. Like, you don't know what you don't know. And, you know, you ask 100 people, hey, are you into personal development? 100 people are going to say yes. Are they? It's like, so 100% of people are just killing it all the time. Really? You know, like, it's really difficult to see yourself in an honest light. You know, some people see themselves as way less than they actually are. Some people see themselves as way more than they actually are. So it's very difficult. And I think a big part of that is the company you keep, you know, like, who are your friends? Are they honest? Are they holding you accountable? You know? So like, I wrote an article a long time. I don't even know where it is. but anyways, I think it was called "Good Coaches Keep Their Clients Accountable, Great Coaches Don't." You know, and that's sort of like.
What do you mean by that?
So, you know, if you're a novice, right, you need a little bit more hand-holding, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're a good coach, you don't necessarily need to hold their hand in order to guide them from where they're at, right? So let's say we'll just talk about nutrition because that's probably the easiest way to convey it. So let's say we're talking about nutrition. We're working with someone who's never done anything before, right? They're like obese, they're sedentary, they're just not active at all. What's our starting point? Are we going to start them with macros? No, we're not going to start them with macros, right? I'm going to start them with something that they can actually do and they can do consistently. It's going to be so goddamn easy that they're probably going to be mad that it's so easy until they try it. And they're like, oh shit, it was kind of harder than I thought to eat a serving of vegetables every day for 7 days in a row. That was harder than I thought, right? But it gives them something they can do. And I'm not holding their hands. I'm just looking at the end and being like, oh, are you doing it? I'm not texting them, hey, did you get your veggies in? Hey, did you do, like, no, that's bullshit. That's keeping them weak. Give them something where they can be strong on their own, where they can develop skills on their own. They can build their own self-efficacy because now they're expanding their level of competence and what they can actually tolerate. And then over time, that builds and builds and builds, right? So at no point am I necessarily like holding them accountable. I'll have those honest conversations, but I'm not like, I shouldn't say accountability, but because you are holding them accountable, but you're not holding their hand. You're not coddling them, right? Because when you coddle someone, you're not allowing them to stand on their own, right? And that's kind of what I mean. But I guess we're kind of, does that answer your question?
No, that makes sense. Yeah.
But to kind of loop it back to what we were talking about before about like just the self-awareness piece, like every year I like to give like my really, really close friends, like the people I genuinely just trust and like I respect their judgment on certain things. I'll ask them like what my strengths and weaknesses are. And they usually come up with like 3 to 5 things or something like that, which is actually, this is a really difficult exercise to do. The first time I did it, I thought I was like, oh, I kind of know what they'll say, you know, because I roughly know what my strengths will be. I swear, it was like getting kicked in the dick by a freaking Mack truck. It was rough. It was really brutal. Like one of the pieces of feedback that I got was, you're so argumentative. This was like many years ago. They were like, you're so argumentative. I don't want to invite you out with my friends because I'm afraid you're going to argue with them. And when I heard that, I was like, that fucking sucks because I know someone who's like that who I don't do that for. And now knowing that I'm like that, I was like, man, that I feel like shit now, you know? And that was just like, that's like a nice thing.
Yeah.
That was one of the nicer ones about me, you know? And so when you hear that stuff, it's incredibly confronting. But if you're genuine, you know, it'll take you a couple of weeks to kind of like, at first you're like, no, that's not true. And you just can't admit it. And then you have to actively look and be like, okay, if this were true, what else in my life would I also notice? Like what else would also happen if this were true? And you can kind of like sort of search for evidence retrospectively, I guess. And then validate it. If it's true, you're like, oh shit, yeah, I guess I do have a history of doing that. And then you can kind of come to change it. So for me, it takes me a while to really go through those things and actually like understand it, get over my own resistance and sort of internalize it and start changing my behavior. But that was something I started doing, I don't know, several years ago. And
how did you go about presenting that to the people the first time that you did it?
What do you mean presenting?
Well, say you're going to ask somebody to do that for you, because if somebody sent that to me, I'd be like, man, I don't know what I wanted. So you got to let them know. Like, how did you let them know?
Right.
You know, look, I'm not going to think you're an asshole for telling me what you really think.
I think a big part of it is just also my temperament. Like, I'm a very direct person. I don't tend to sugarcoat things. Like, pretty brutally honest about stuff. And so that's one thing that I just kind of remind them of. I'm like, hey, you know what? I'm realizing like there are certain aspects of my life that I'm just, you know, struggling with, or I'm not as good at. And I keep hearing similar feedback from other people. And so, you know, what I think I need to do isn't what I need to do, because I keep running into the same problems and I think I'm working on it, but it's just not happening. So I really want your honest feedback, and I want it on these specific things. You know, I want to be a better person. And you can kind of centralize it, right? So for me, it's just personal development. I'm like, I just want to be a better person. I want to be a better friend. I want to be a better family member. I want to be a better partner, whatever. You know, so I need you to tell me things like, what are my blind spots? You know, where am I really weak? What are some of the things that make me a weak person, or make me, you know, you not want to be around me at times, or whatever, right? And so I'll just kind of have a conversation with them about it, answer any questions, clarify anything that's maybe a little bit ambiguous. And then, they usually take a couple of weeks and they come back with some like really, really impactful information. And I think the thing is, you have to really make sure, like, hey, I want you to be fucking honest. Like, if you read it and you're like, oh man, that's tough, but I can see what they're saying. Like, then they didn't do the exercise, or you're just not allowing the exercise to sink in. It's like, these are things that if you read, or maybe I'm just really fucked up and that's why, but it's like things if you read that, like, it honestly, like, will kind of break your heart, like, it just really makes you sad and is really hurtful,
Now, outside of that one thing, were there other things that they would come in? You don't need to tell me what they are. It's just a general question that when you read it, you knew already was the problem or needed work, not a problem, but needed work.
Yeah. So one thing, for instance, is I read quite a bit, and just with my work and like what I have to do, I have to present complex topics in a very simplistic way. So I have to be very, very, clear in my communication. I have to be very articulate. And the benefit of that is I'm very good at debate. Mm-hmm. So if anyone debates me on something and it's just like this, I'm really good at it, and I'm very, very comfortable just like going in and picking up, which is great on the one hand. However, if someone's not necessarily very good at it, they might be right, but because I'm better at this skill of debate, I'm going to win.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that was something that I really struggled with, was because a big part of an individual's intelligence, at least for a long time for me, would be predicated on their ability to debate and communicate things clearly and quickly too. Mm-hmm. And so if they couldn't do that, I'd be like, I don't really respect this person's intelligence. And it took me a while to realize that that's only one very small aspect of intelligence. And so that basically made me come off as like arrogant and obtuse at times. And I totally understand why, right? Because but that's also a bit of a cultural thing, just because like where I'm from, you're very direct. Like my grandma saw me when I was fat and she's like, oh, you look disgusting. Why are you so fat? Well, no one's going to love you. And everyone in like America and Canada, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe she said that. And it's like, no, it's because she loves me. That's why. Right. Yeah. So it's like a bit of a culture thing, like just that level of directness. So I never saw it as combative. I was just like, no, we're just talking, but it comes off that way a lot of the times. And I didn't realize how that was putting a strain on my relationships, and also just straining my own ability to learn, to grow, to just be a better individual. So that was another really big one that I had to kind of overcome and still have to work on for sure. So.
Well, you grew up in a commune, right? And with 7 siblings, and how many different countries?
How did you know that?
I do my research, dude. Right? So, I mean, that there is going to make you want to find a way to get attention. You know what I'm saying? 7 siblings, is that right? You're one of 7.
Yeah, I'm one of, yeah. So it was, 7 total.
7 total, yeah. So that I would assume, because I do believe that our childhood shapes who we are. Doesn't mean that's who we need to be, right? But it shapes the values and who we are and all that kind of stuff. And you either lean into it or you got to resist against it to some degree. Yeah. Where one of the exercises that I do is kind of similar to what you're talking about, is if I had to compete against myself, what would I find as my weaknesses? So if I had to compete against myself, if I had to compete against myself in business, where would I go? Right? If I had to compete against myself as a coach, where am I going to go? Like, how am I going to beat me? Right? And you just don't want to admit it, right? Yeah. Because then it becomes, because all the holes, right? Then it becomes, you can't fill all of them by any means, right? Because if you fix every weakness, there's no strength. Right. There's not. So it's like, okay, what's the most important? What's the most vulnerable? Or what's the one I don't want to do the most? Because that's probably the one that you need to do. Because a lot of times people don't have those people who will be honest with them. Yeah. Right. And even if you do, sometimes they'll be honest to a point. Not.
And that's the difficult thing. Yeah.
That's why I asked, how did you actually ask these things? Because it kind of plays into that. But it's huge, for the development, just your personal development from one thing, but your development as a coach as well. And your ability to, communication is kind of like a vital tool, right?
It's a little important.
Yeah. And I think a lot of us that filter into the strength sports probably aren't the best communicators in the world, because we end up in a sport that's an individual type sport. Broad assumption here, but it's pretty much been the case with almost everybody that I know. So it becomes even a bigger thing is a shitty word, a bigger thing to be able to be self-aware of, to be able to know that. Because I think even if I could go back when I was still competing, had I been more self-aware, I would have been a better lifter.
Yeah.
Because I would have recovered better, because I wouldn't have been as pissed off about stupid things that were increasing my cortisol and making it harder for me to recover. You work with lifters on all levels of the scale. Mm-hmm. So when you're dealing with those at the higher level, does this become part of a conversation? Not just the recovery aspect from, look, you need to sleep and the basic shit, right? But you have to be able to control as much of the outside factors to lower stress to be able to recover. Mm-hmm. And how do you go about working with them with that?
Yeah. So, I think the biggest thing is, it's funny because I tell people this all the time. They'll be like, oh, what's your biggest, what's your area of specialty? And I'm like, honestly, it's communication. Because I've always said, like, I'm not the best at programming. I'm not the best at, I don't know, let's just say like some of the technical stuff. Like, I'm definitely confident in my ability as a coach. I've definitely, coached high level athletes and stuff like that. But I'll look at people and I'm like, yeah, like, I'm good at this, but I'm not like excellent. I'm good at this, but I'm not excellent. And I think one of the areas that I've really, really do feel like I am like fantastic at is communication and developing relationships. So my strategy has always been, not always, but has sort of, I guess, evolved to really build that relationship. And so they give me more, because I can make, like, let's say I have an excellent program and I give that to an athlete, but they don't really like it. We're not communicating very well. They don't really feel any sort of like, I guess, responsibility to me. I don't know if that's the right word, but you know what I mean? Like,
no, I get what you're saying. Like almost accountability, but not even that either.
Yeah. It's like this, like they're like, I have to do this because I owe it to them. I don't want to let them down, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So like when I have that, I get more out of my athletes. So if I have a deficit, let's say in my programming or in my nutrition, or if there's something that I'm not like really, really, really good at, I can fill a lot of that just by getting them to execute at such a high level of output. So I've always found that communication and how I'm structuring my approach from like a more holistic standpoint has been my biggest strength. So anytime I take an athlete on, the number one thing that I emphasize is communication. I always say, hey, the athletes I communicate with the best are the ones who are at the highest level. The athletes who communicate with me the most, they have the best time training, they avoid the most injuries, they do this, 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 and this, which is true. It's not me bullshitting. It's because I know what's going on with them. I know what's going on in their lives. I know like all about them, their vacations, their stress, what's going on with work, if they're launching a new product, if they're doing a new startup. I know all of those things. Now, I don't need to know intimate details, but they will tell me like, hey, I had a fight with my significant other or something like that, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, cool. Maybe we need to change something. So in knowing all that stuff, I have my finger like on the pulse really, really closely, so I can auto-regulate to such a high degree each week, because I do my programming in weekly blocks. Now I'll have a longer term plan, but each iteration is going to be 1 week long. So I might pull a set here, I might change this, I might change that, I might turn this to a tempo or whatever, based on whatever's going on in their lives. So I track everything, not just their training. I'm looking at their sleep, I'm looking at their mood, I'm looking at their perception of training, I'm looking at their stress levels, I'm looking at their sleep, their body weight, their water intake, any sort of nutritional behaviors that are relevant for them, because not everyone wants to work on their nutrition, but it's still obviously very relevant. We look at like, their sleep hygiene protocol, sleep latency, if they have any issues with that, if they're, if they have sleep apnea, we talk about a CPAP, we talk about maybe reducing their body weight or doing something. So it's like, I'm looking for as many different variables as I can touch and being able to moderate all that, because if I can do all of that, then I get the synergistic effect where now, what was, a good program is now turned into a fantastic program, because everything is now working in unison. And so I think that my biggest strength as a coach is that, and that's how I'll try and like frame those conversations where I'll be like, okay, here's how we're going to do. We're going to start with you with where you're at right now. And, this is kind of optimal. Now, we don't necessarily, maybe we never get there. It just depends on how dedicated you are, what kind of trade-offs you're willing to make, like what ultimately you want your lifestyle to look like and stuff like that. So I'll kind of explain it right from the get-go, then set expectations. I'll tell them how I communicate with people, how I work with clients. And then I'll be like, here's what you can expect from me. And then we just basically start, and then we just keep progressing things based on whatever rate they can manage. Maybe it's a really fast rate. Maybe it's very, very slow. I have one client who I've been working with for several months now, and only now are they just starting to track their macros. We've been working for like several months, and they don't even have a macro plan, but they're just starting to work on their macros. But they're down like a bunch of weight. Their strength has gone up like an insane amount during that time, and they're just a general health client, right? And so like every person is going to be different. Every approach is going to be different, but I'm really, really big on kind of education and educating them and being like, here's how your sleep affects your performance. Because if they don't give a shit about their body composition, that's fine. But is your body composition impairing your performance? Oh, well, that's something they care about. So now I can get buy-in here. Now I can get them eating a little better. Now I can get them a little bit leaner. Now I can get them focusing on their protein and maybe the nutrient timing strategy. Now we can start talking about hydration, because, hey, 1% reduction in hydration can result in up to 10% reduction in strength performance, right? And there's a whole list of things. And so I'll try and educate, and then I'll be like, where do you want, like, how serious do you want to go into this? And then maybe initially they're not super serious and they only want to go to here. But then once they get here, they're like, fuck, I like this stuff, man. This is awesome. I want to go to here. And then they go to here, and then they go to here, and they just keep upping it. Cause like, I certainly know that when I first started like lifting, I wasn't like, oh, I want to do this and I want to squat 800 pounds. Blah, blah, blah. Like, that's never been my goal. Initially, I was just like, I just don't want to be insecure and fat anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But then you start doing it, and all of a sudden you're, it kind of evolves. And I think that was a really ranty, long
No, it's good.
version,
It's good because it's, everybody's different. I get that, but I've seen patterns, and I wonder if you see the same pattern, to where the people who want to say this is, I forget the word that you use, this is the
optimal.
The optimal.
Yeah.
The people that want to jump straight to the optimal and will do it and will be compliant to a 100th degree, they're great, but they don't last long. Yeah. Right? So it's like they burn out. Where it's great to see, and this is even with the higher level lifters that I've worked with, I almost kind of want to kick them back a little bit, to make them hear, so the changes that need to happen will stay. Because a lot of times, if it's sleep hygiene or things that you're talking about there, it will change for the 10 weeks before the meet. Yeah. And then after the meet, it just goes right back to shit again, where it's like, you know what, if it didn't just radically all change on this one day, and it just would have slowly, kind of migrated into what you're talking about, I wonder, I don't know, right? Because they're vastly different people. Yeah. And I've never been able to kick this one down, and this one is easier, but it's a slower pattern too. Yeah. Have you seen the same patterns?
I've definitely seen the same patterns. Everyone always wants to run before they can walk. And the way that I'll usually try and explain it is like, I explain it as a skill. Diet, lifestyle interventions, like these are all skills. And I think where people get tripped up is they look at dieting as like, what's the skill involved? Eat this, don't eat this. They break it down into individual constituents or components of whatever needs to be done in aggregate. And they say, I can go to bed at this time. I can read a book at this time leading up to it. I can wear, whatever the blue light blocking glasses. I can go for a walk. I can do they can do all of those things, but you can't do it all together. And I'll try to explain that. And they're like, oh, no, sure I can. I'm like, okay, let's put it this way. I used to box. If I had you for a week and we just trained the jab, at the end of that week, you'd have a fucking great jab. Mm-hmm. It would look really nice. Like if someone didn't know that you were brand new to fighting, they'd be like, this guy's actually pretty good. Like he's got some pretty good skill, right? Now let's put you in a ring. In an active scenario where you're sparring someone and they're cracking you in the face, how quickly do you think that jab is just going to revert back to like panic fighting? Mm-hmm. Just like that. Because now you're in a real situation where we have unpredictable circumstances and environmental variables that are now coming in and influencing your behavior. And that's exactly what happens with diet. Like I had to travel for this. So last week I was in a seminar, I was helping facilitate a seminar in Canada. My diet, not great over there because I hadn't traveled in a long time, and so I wasn't like I'd kind of planned, but I'd forgotten a lot of the details about it. And I was like, oh, fuck. So this week I was like, okay, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm finding a grocery store. I'm doing this. I'm planning all these things out. I'm bringing my Tupperware because I didn't have that the first time. I'm bringing this and this. So I had everything planned. I got here. I've been on my diet. No problem. Right. But, and I'm someone who's really experienced with dieting. And that was something that was hard for me when traveling because it's just not something I normally experienced. But how many times does each person, especially if you're not super experienced, have something that throws them off their diet, their sleep, their whatever? What if you have kids and your kids wake you up at night? What do you do then? You know, so I think it's really important to like educate and be like, so long as we're going like this, it doesn't matter if when we zoom in, we're having these little fluctuations or perturbations. That's fine. So long as we're trending upwards, that's great.
What's this look like in a remote environment though? Because you're working with them remotely.
Yep. Same exact thing. It's just a conversation. So I guess maybe elaborate a little more.
It's so, I mean, are you having weekly conversations with everybody, right? Because that would take forever, right?
Yeah.
Or a lot of the data points coming to you through whatever program, Excel or whatever you're using for that.
Yeah.
And then how do you keep the compliance of what they're giving you at the standard that you need?
Right. So I basically create a check-in sheet. And my check-in sheet is going to be whatever that individual needs. There's certain things that I just like to see pretty much for everyone. I want to see their step count. I want to see their sleep. I want to see their body weight usually. And I want to know like subjective variables. So I want to know what their mood is. I want to know what their perception of training is. I want to know if they have any injuries. I want to know if they're stressed out. Like there are just certain things that I just want to know, period. And then beyond that, all the other stuff might be variable depending on the individual, right? So I might have someone tracking macros. I might have another person just being like, hey, your goals for the week are purely behavior driven. I'm a big advocate of like behavior-based goals or adherence neutral goals. So where essentially we just establish like, this is the goal. And in order to do that, we need to do this. But in order to do that, we need to do this. In order to that, and we just kind of reverse engineer it down to the most basic thing that they can do today. So maybe that's literally something as simple as I just want you to eat 2 servings combined of fruit and veggies per day. So it could be 1 fruit, 1 veggie, or 2 fruit or 2 veggie. That's fine. But that's all I want you to do. And then they do that. And then once we rate their adherence, you know, because we can check it every single day. And then at the end of the week, we tally it up and say, okay, what was your percentage rate of adherence? And then once it kind of passes a certain threshold, then we add the next thing if they feel confident in it. And if they don't, we just repeat it. Right. And I just had that conversation with them. I'm like, everyone's failed diets, so it's not super hard to get a lot of buy-in. I'm like, hey, you guys thought this worked, right? But did it? No? Okay, good. This is why we need to do it this way. So you can build up the skills so that you can do it regardless, right? Because when you first learn how to drive, you're checking your mirrors, you're checking your speed, your brake, and my signaling, all that. It's really overwhelming. But then over time, you just don't even think about it, right? Like you could be driving while texting and fucking eating a bowl of mashed potatoes, and you're good. Don't do that, but but you're fine because you've done it for so long. And so that's essentially what I try and do, where it's like we build this runway for progression so they can actually develop the skills to actually get there. Now, how I go about doing that is I do that check-in, but then I record a video. So I use Loom, or I was using like Google Hangouts or whatever, but I really like Loom now that I'm using it. So they see my face. They see me reading everything. They see me going through every point and being like, here's what I need you to do. This is fantastic, blah, blah, blah. I really try and prop them up. Like I don't bullshit them, right? All my compliments are genuine, but I try and acknowledge the things they're doing really well because that helps reinforce their self-efficacy. The more efficacious they feel, the more they're going to adhere to that because the more they're adopting this identity of, oh, I'm good at this. This is something that I'm winning at. I'm getting better at lifting. I'm getting better at my diet, my nutrition, my hydration, my sleep, all that stuff. And so then you just kind of see over time how we start slowly expanding things the same way that you wouldn't just toss 500 on the bar and be like, hey, bench this. You'd be like, okay, where are you at? Oh, 225? Okay, you do 225 today. Maybe next week you do 230. Maybe next week, you know what I mean? And you kind of progress it that way. And I really find that when they see my face, when they hear my voice, and they see me going through everything, that, in my experience, has been massively beneficial for buy-in because they see that I care. They hear me say like, hey, you've been doing a great job. I'm really happy with this. I treat them like a human being. If they fuck up, I'm not like, you're a piece of shit, blah, blah, blah. I'm just like, hey, you know what? You were on vacation And like, if I see those things coming up too, I'll preemptively say, hey, I know you're going on vacation. I don't want you to be super strict. I want you to prioritize your family and have fun. And so I try and treat them like a human being.
Yeah.
I'm not just like, oh, it's all or nothing, brother, or whatever, you know, like, so, and I think all of those ways that I'm communicating with them, it like acknowledges what they're actually going through in their regular life. Like, I'm building that relationship over time. And so that when I do need them to just focus for a period, I'm like, hey, normally we do this, but because you've got this meet coming up, this is fucking go time. We don't have the luxury of going on vacation anymore. If you go on vacation, I want you to be doing this still. Okay. And then because I've, you know, been so like, because I take like a collaborative approach normally, now when I'm asking them this, they can go and they can push hard for, you know, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, or sorry, 3 months, 4 months, whatever it might be. And that's fine. Right. So that's usually how I'll do things. And then so every now and then they'll kind of like message me, but I think if you do a really good job with the check-ins, you don't really need tons of additional stuff, especially if you're getting the right type of feedback.
Have you found that some of the behavioral changes that you're doing, say hydration or getting to bed at a certain time, impacts their weight loss without actually impacting their weight, without telling them they actually need to eat less?
100%. So I'm a big fan of like adding things as opposed to eliminating things. So the client I just mentioned about who just started tracking macros, so he's down, I think like 13 pounds or whatever. I have not told him he can't eat anything. At no point have I ever said, don't eat this about anything. I've been like, I don't care what you eat. I just want you to do this as well. So I like to start off by increasing protein intake, increasing fruit and vegetable intake, and just kind of checking off your micros, your macros, some of those basic things. Like outside of that, you can have 10 pizzas. And they're like, no, really? And I'm like, no, I don't give a shit. You can literally eat whatever you want. And I know some people might be worried that they're going to overeat, but if you work up to eating 6 or 7 combined servings of fruits and vegetables, plus, 5 servings of protein a day, you're not eating that much more. That's a lot. And so they're going to feel better. They're going to recover better. They're going to perform better. And they're going to be like, oh, I'm starting to lose weight a little bit, and I haven't restricted anything. And so I think it just sort of acknowledges their lifestyle. It acknowledges like where they're at. It acknowledges their difficulty in dieting before, because they had this perception of how dieting is supposed to work. And then you kind of flip the script on them and say, no, we don't need to do any of that stuff. Like we're not even there yet. So you have so many levers that you can pull from that I try not to go to the main ones that people are thinking about. Like, hey, I want you to start only eat out like once or twice a week. Because right now you're doing 4 times. Let's just try and cut it down to 3. Because even that stuff, I'm not saying it's bad. Like I've done that before, but I've always found that like when you try and add stuff, it makes it a little bit easier for people to do it and not necessarily think like they're on a diet, because for the exact reason that you said.
No, I agree. We have more trainers and more strength coaches than we've ever had, but the obesity rate is higher than it's ever been. Yeah. So either we're failing miserably or there's more going on there, right? Yeah. So lifestyle is a huge factor, with all this, where the basic things that you're talking about, steps, if they go from not tracking steps at all to just tracking them, they're probably going to get more.
100%.
Just because of that. Water is the same thing. Like, look, man, I just want to have whatever, 8 glasses or whatever you're going to have. Just drink more water. They're going to drink more water. Yeah. And then their energy will go up. Their hydration goes up, their energy goes up. Their energy goes up, maybe they move a little bit more. Yeah. So, it's changing, like you said, it's changing by adding, but it's also not doing everything that they've done before, which has failed. Yeah. Because as soon as you start asking them to do the same things that they've done before, but telling them they're going to get a different result, that's kind of fucking insane. Yeah. Because why are they going to think they're going to have a different result just because it's a different person? Yeah. And it's almost like tricking them, right?
That's 100% what it is. And I mean, the food journal example that you gave is actually a fantastic example, because like 99 times out of 100, you give someone a food journal, they're going to start logging their food. And sometimes it happens where you get it and you're like, that's not what you're eating. Do it again. No, that's not what you're eating. Do it again. And then by like week 3, like, okay, yeah, that's an accurate representation of what you're eating. I don't even need to know. I'm just like, this is 1,200 calories. You're 250. There's no way. You know what I mean? Yeah. And just that awareness piece, like they don't want to write down that I had a Rice Krispie. So they just won't eat it. But so I haven't told them to do anything. But exactly like you said, it creates awareness around like a lot of their behaviors. And that the awareness piece, man, that's so critical for nutrition. Because like you said, there's so many other variables that go into like the weight, right? Like there's so many environmental variables. Like if you're a kid who has obese parents or overweight parents, your likelihood of ending up overweight or obese goes up by a multiple of 12, which is freaking astronomical, right? But then also you're looking at like intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. You start telling your kid, hey, you need to lose weight because you look like shit or something like that, or it's unhealthy. Now they're going to start maybe messing with their head. So it's like, how do you approach that from a perspective that is going to allow them to want to do these things? Not because they like feel like shit about it, but because they're like, hey, I really like this, you know? And that's kind of like when you get kids exercising or something like that. And you're like, hey, like you'll perform better if you just focus on your diet a little bit more. And all of a sudden like, oh my God, and it has nothing to do with weight loss. But so you can kind of, you do 100% manipulate your clients to get the results you want. But it's like kind of for their own good, as bad as it sounds.
No, it's what I'm wondering is I kind of got stuck on the obesity rate, you know, the parents with the kids being 8 times higher, whatever you said that was.
12.
12, I mean, which is ridiculously, it's absurd. It's absurd. Where if that was more common knowledge, you would think that if the parents knew that and then they struggled with it, they would do everything that they could to not let that happen, you know, to their children. If you see what I'm saying, this is a weird thing to think about because maybe not, right? It's because if it impacted them enough that it bothers them, then I have kids. You don't want your kids to go through the same things that you went through.
Yeah.
Like that was one of my biggest goals with my kids is that they're not going to go through the same shit that I went through, but I was conscious enough that they have to go through their own shit because they still need shit, right? You still need adversity to help. Yeah. You can't, I don't feel that you can raise kids in an environment with no adversity because they're going to get in the real life and then they're going to get smacked with it. And you don't want them to, their first, 19 years old, their first major adversity is somebody said, you're fat or whatever it is. And it ruins their whole day and job and they quit. Like it has to be more than what that is, but it shouldn't, I don't want it to be what I had. I mean, if you have children, you don't want it to be the adversity that you had. Right? Because it's the last thing that we want, but there has to be some. That's where my head goes when I hear things like that. It's like, okay, if that's that, then that would be the last thing that I would want for that, but I'm making a broad assumption on a whole population that I don't know anything about.
I think you're right, though, and I think you do have a lot of insight because, like, outside of the whole obesity thing, you're a parent.
Yeah.
And I'm not a parent, so I don't know what that's like, but I can only imagine that you're going to do anything you can to give your kids the best outcome. And so, like, I would imagine most parents are probably going to be fairly concerned. I think the problem is in how they approach it. At least that's what I've seen based on the research.
Well, I think there's also the question of what defines the best outcome, right? Because if you raise them without adversity or you don't let them make their mistakes, then is that really going to be the best outcome when they're adults, right? I mean, this is a head fuck for anybody that has kids, by the way.
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh shit, what's that going to be? But it is that different perspective, that kind of plays into that where I don't know. Like with the obesity thing, I would be, and it's a huge assumption, I would be led to believe that would cause the obesity rate to go down, but it's not happening. If they were aware, like if that bothered them, right? The obesity was something that they're like, and I'm making an assumption, that obese parents don't want to be obese. Maybe they do, I don't know. That's a big assumption to be able to make, but then that would be the last thing that they would want for their children, because of the health impacts and all the other things that are associated with that. And if I were right, the obesity rate would be going down.
I mean,
things at a macro level are never what they seem.
Yeah, I think because there's a big disconnect. Like, it's a pretty long distance away. Like, I honestly agree with you. I think that most parents are not going to want their kids to experience, like, I guess what I'll call unnecessary struggles like that, where it's like, they have to have their own struggles, just like you were saying, because they need to be tough, they need to be resilient, they need all these things. but they don't need to become addicted to drugs just to get off, to be like, hey, you shouldn't do drugs. You know, it's like there's a bit of a limit, you know. Like, don't let them run with scissors, because that's a bit of a terrible learning curve, you know. So I definitely get what you're saying. The disconnect between not wanting your kids to be, and again, I have to caveat there, or like preface this with like, I'm not a parent. I have no fucking clue, you know, but just my understanding of, you know, how the research is looking right now. It's a huge gap between, you know, that desire to, you know, not have their kids be overweight, or them not be overweight, but then actually enacting those behaviors that are going to lead to that eventually. And then how you go about that, right? Because like, people typically don't want to be overweight. And, you know, this is something I hear a lot, which honestly really frustrates me. I'm not sure if you want to go into this tangent, but the whole obesity isn't a choice thing, or obesity is, what is it? Obesity. Yeah. Obesity isn't choice. I've heard so many people say that. And I'm like, it's the most disingenuous comment I've heard in years, because it's overly reductionist, which means it doesn't actually allow for any sort of context or nuance. Because if you were to say, is obesity a choice? Well, simply for the fact that there's other variables outside of just your specific choice, then no, you'd have to say it's not, right? However, is it a series of choices? Absolutely. And now that completely changes things, right? Because if obesity isn't a choice, then neither is health. Neither is fitness. Neither is getting a degree. Neither is it, because it's like the same things that are going to affect you in terms of your weight and successful or unsuccessful weight management also affect you in every other aspect of your life. Now, they might affect people differently, and it's not to say that this specific variable is also going to affect every other variable, but like, it's not a closed system, right? So it's like, okay, well, how come you can express discipline with your education, but you can't express discipline in your eating habits, right? And so it's like a bit of a disingenuous conversation where it's like people, it's like framing it like obesity is a choice is just a stupid way to do things, but it's absolutely a series of choices that people make. And when we look at it from that perspective, that's not blaming anyone. That should be empowering. That should create awareness. Hey, if you got here through a series of choices, we can also get out of it, or at the very least improve your situation. So what might that look like? You know, and that's where you kind of have to get into that really deep context of like, you know, what's their current lifestyle like? What is their partner like? Maybe their partner just doesn't give a shit about fitness, but you do, and they're constantly thwarting or undermining your attempts. Maybe you live in like, you know, an area where like there's a huge social element to food, right? Which it pretty much is like everywhere in the world, but where you're constantly going over your family's house, they're constantly just feeding everyone and doing all this stuff. Like, how do you navigate those situations? It's not always an easy answer. And so I think that's where like the level of individualization really, really has to be precise in determining like how you're going to approach that. And then if they don't know how to do it for themselves, how are they going to do it for their kids?
Yes.
You know, and that's kind of that. It's
that's
like
a circle, right? Because it's a loop, right? Because you know, I've often been told that outside of school lunch and food that a neighbor may give a kid, kids don't go to the grocery store to buy their food, right? So the childhood obesity rate obviously is going to be dependent upon whoever's providing the food and giving them the food, where you can almost make the argument for that child, then is there really a choice? Because they're just eating what's put in front of them. They don't know any better. Yeah. Where that could extend then to the adults that they don't know any better either. Right? Where at some point somebody has to know better. Yeah. So it's I'm not saying that I disagree, because I agree with what you're saying. Yeah. I'm saying when they're that young, right, they don't know any different. They're 1, 2, 3. Yeah. You know, if somebody's obese at 5 years old, I seriously doubt that they had any idea, right? But you know, on the receiving end, if you're that child and then you're 10 years old and you're 100 pounds overweight, like what the fuck? You know, now they got health conditions that they're going to have to contend with. That is it really their problem? You know, is it cause is probably a better word. Is it really their cause? You know, so it's not doing that children any favor, but the argument that could go with that is the education sucks around this, you know, thus the parents don't know what, and it's a rabbit hole. It's
and that's honestly the exact reason why I hate the phrasing of that, because it seems like someone specifically worded it in that way to just convolute the actual conversation that needs to happen around that. Because the moment you say, is obesity a choice? You're like, well, no one's choosing to be obese. Like, come on, man. Like, this is ridiculous. Yeah. And so it's just like,
well, that phrasing
is,
phrasing is chosen for a reason.
100%.
You know, which it does. And it's for the reason that exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
You know, where then what's the answer? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
You know, then that gets, I don't know, you know, it's the crazy thing with anything at a broad level like that. Whatever you think the answer is that we're being presented with usually isn't the right answer. We'll just find out fucking 10 years later it was completely the wrong answer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, honestly, like the childhood development is something I've really been interested in learning about. But again, I am incredibly limited because I'm reading about it. Yeah. So I can read everything that I want, but like, you know, the map is not the terrain. Like you're someone who I would be like, okay, you've got a lot of experience raising your own kids. Yeah. Like how is, I don't know if you mind if I ask you a question about this, but like, how is it something that you approach, or is that even something that's like a concern? Of course.
I mean, health is on the forefront, and with my kids are older now, right? Where I grew up in a weight room, right? So there was always this thing of I don't want to force my kids into training. You know, my youngest does no training at all, you know, but I can force them into healthy choices, right? You know, and moving and you know, professions that move more, and, you know, being conscious of those decisions, because they may not, you know, train in the weight room per se, but they don't also need to be 450 pounds. You know, they also need to be health conscious of whatever they're doing. That I have more control over, where with my oldest that's on the spectrum, training was a part, but I wasn't the one able to deliver it. Sheena had to do that, you know, but being aware enough that I can't deliver this, you know, it's the wrong message, that somebody else has got to be the one to do this, is being a parent, you know, is being able to step aside to let somebody help with that, you know, because there's different challenges that will come with somebody that's on the spectrum. You know, and so, but health has got to be part of that, because you're dealing with, they may never, the bad choice of words, it may be harder for them to know what's a good choice and a bad choice. You know, over a period of time, it will kind of work its way out. But in the short term, it's not going to be so much the case. It's going to be what tastes good, what doesn't taste good. You know, so how do you not let that become so far off the rails? Well, you don't put it in the house. You know, kind of, it goes back to that, but me being aware that this can be what potential challenges are, and then, you know, obviously letting them cut their own path and all the other kind of stuff, and not forcing. You know, there were a couple times where, you know, my youngest expressed interest. I'm like, yeah, and that was short lived. Like, okay, it's like, you know, I would rather embrace what he loves, you know, and to help push and support that, and try to impose upon them what I do, right? It's their life. But health encompasses all professions, in my opinion, right? Because you're going to have better days at work. You're going to be able to focus better. You're going to be able to produce a better output. You're going to be able to still have energy if it's when you go home, you know, if for other things to be able to do. Outside of getting hit by a car and tragic events, you should have a better, higher quality of life. You know, those type of things. And now, granted, when they were younger, you know, in baseball and stuff, I'm conscious of, okay, this is a 4 to 6 year old now. This is when this attribute can best be developed, visual acuity, or, you know, strength, endurance, speed. I'm covering those bases with participation in different sports. You know, if it's wrestling or baseball or BMX when they were younger, anything to be able to try to not completely harness it, because I don't want to, you know, force it on them, but not lose that ability to have that skill acquisition when it's at its prime. Now, of course, the majority of parents aren't going to know this. This is supposed to be instituted in physical education classes, which I'm sure it no longer is. You know, so that becomes something that I think us as educators have to do a better job being able to provide, you know, people out there, so they're more conscious and aware that these are developmental years for certain things, and not force it on them. I guess I don't know if I really answered that, but it's how I kind of looked at it, because I don't want to waste all the education that I had, you know, and they're my own kids, but it's a balance, you know, because I've seen other people that force, you know, the things on their kids, you know, oh, there's powerlifting being some of the, I roll my eyes, right? Because like, come on, man, you know, fucking 12-year-old, there's a thousand other things they can do outside of, if they want to powerlift, that's great, but fuck, you know, there's so many other, learn how to move, you know, learn these other things that they need to learn at that age. It can be a piece of it, but man, it shouldn't fucking be all of it. You know, that will make me rant here in a minute, to be honest with you, because that drives me fucking insane. Yeah. You know, especially at that age, because it's not like there's so many different things they can do. You know, you just look at, well, I don't want to say the paper, right? Because I'm going to date myself, right? Like look in the paper and see what leagues are going on and stuff like that. And, you know, not all of them are cost money, you know, and stuff like that where I'll just stop because I'm going to.
No, but I mean, you give up a lot of really important points. I mean, the first one is like early specialization that you talked about, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you're a kid and you get into powerlifting, awesome, but your ability to develop in that sport is going to be significantly impaired because you didn't play a bunch of sports. Yeah. Because of the motor learning and everything, like just your active, like developmentally, it's a huge deal. And it was funny because when I learned that, I was kind of surprised. I was like, oh man, if I started my kid at 5, like just think where he'd be when he's like 25. And you're like, oh, it's actually worse for them if they're not going and doing a bunch of different shit. But the thing that I thought was really cool was you were kind of like, hey, what do you guys like to do, you know, to your kids? And whether it's like, I don't know, football, frisbee, cycling, I have no idea, right? But like, because when was the last time you needed to like be forced or told to go and play a game of, you know, football with your friends if that's what you really love to do? You know, like that's not exercise. It's not being penalized. It's not like being forced to work out. It's just, you're just having fun, but you're also being active. You're also running. You're also training. You're also doing all these great things. So that's really cool.
The difficult one is when they choose things that you have no interest in, but then you have to somehow or another, you know, develop an interest in that. But for me, it was just reminding myself that, oh, they see that as I saw powerlifting. Simple.
Yeah. Okay. What were some of those?
But just gaming could be one. You know, welding. Yeah. My youngest is a welder, so the welding's one. You know, things of that sort. You know, figuring shit out as far as like machinery and stuff. I can't change my own fucking oil. You know, just you know, things like that. You know, it's just completely out of my wheelhouse. You know, where that's fine. You know, it's just recognizing that and like who can help them with that in the best capacity for that, and then okay, that's like how I saw powerlifting, and that's how I saw this or whatever things I was somewhat passionate about, but not all the way. You know, wrestling, other sports like that, just not the same as powerlifting. That was different. You know, so it's like, where is this on that? Trying to relate it to myself in a way that I could flip it to them instead of trying to sit there and think they see. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think it's kind of funny because every now and then, like, you kind of will have to remind yourself, like, I'll look at someone and I'll be like, how do they find that fun? Like, I'll play a video game for like 2 minutes and I'm like, I'm done. Yeah. And I'm like, how do people find that fun? Like, it's so ridiculous. And then I think, and I'm like, oh, I like sitting down and standing back up again. Yeah. Like, what the fuck? Yeah. Who am I to say anything? So I'm like, all right. People like what they like. Like, what I like is so arbitrary. Yeah. So it's just like, I think everyone's hobbies just are pretty arbitrary.
That's a good topic right there, too, because with the training over the last 3 decades, you know, it's become, do I want to say more systemized? More organized for certain, that say with your clients and so forth that will come in, there's probably a lot that just don't give a shit about the intricacies behind it. Just tell me what to do. But for us, it's fun, right? So I worry that with a lot of the people that are hiring trainers, coaches, and all this other stuff, it's not fun. It becomes like going to see their doctor or going to see, you know, somebody else that's a therapist, I suppose. I mean, it's a terrible correlation, but, you know, going to see, you know, something that's just the thing that they need to do. And then the fun gets stripped out of it. So how do you try to integrate that in, or do you have a metric to be able to kind of feel out if they're having fun with it? Because even with the hardest training that I've ever done in my whole entire life and the most disciplined training, it's still not all times, but at times, fun. So I think that needs to be integrated in. So do you have a way to track that metric?
Yeah, 100%. So one of the things that I do is I actually have athlete enjoyment as part of my check-in weekly. Interestingly enough, the problem that I ran into was, I think sometimes when you're doing check-ins and you're just rating it on a numerical scale, you kind of just get in the habit of just checking the box.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's like, love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. And then it's like, nah, I can't really stand this anymore. And you're like, whoa, what happened? So one of the things that I've been doing lately is I just will kind of open it up and be like, hey, how are things going? Like, how do you like these exercises? Do you this, do that? And I always frame it that way in the beginning as well. Like before we even start working together, I'll always be like, I want you to enjoy it, because if you enjoy it, you're going to push harder. If you push harder, it's because you're more bought in. You're going to get better results. So I want you to enjoy it. So there are times where like some things that are in the programs aren't going to help them. They're just there because they fucking love it. And if I can make them love their program, and then they just push really hard at the other shit because they just love doing bicep curls or they love doing squats or whatever it is, like I'm going to try and feed into that. So I really, really try and prioritize like having fun for most people, because I think you can still get great results, like pretty much the best results if you're having fun. There's not a lot of concessions. Like people just kind of need a little thing here and there. So I try and talk about it during the weekly check-ins. Maybe not every week, but every now and then I'll just touch base and be like, hey man, how's it going? I know you're getting stronger. I know everything's heading in the right direction. Like I can see that you're kind of hitting these rep PRs. You're we're right on track, but I just wanted to know, like, how are you enjoying training? If they haven't, cause like a lot of the times when they're writing the check-in, man, I'm hitting PRs, like it's feeling great. My shoulder pain has gone away. Like this is awesome. Da, 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 and you can kind of tell. Mm-hmm. But then when they just start to kind of become a little bit more like, yeah, this is good. Da, 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 that's usually when I'll kind of be like, okay, I probably need to touch base, and then just, see how it's going. Maybe we just need to change the block. Maybe we just won't run that block for as long anymore. Maybe we just need to give them some fun exercises. Maybe I need to pull back the volume so they can do more outside. And this is again where I'm kind of stepping outside my scope, but I still think this is really important. Like one of the things that I'm huge on is getting them to do shit that's meaningful outside of the gym.
How so?
So like, especially if someone's really stressed out. And this came from my own experience actually, where I was just like, because I'm very type A. So it's like when I'm doing my macros, recently I've been a little less disciplined, like in the last couple of weeks, but I'm still, I'd say more disciplined than like 98% of people. But like when I was, doing like my long cut diet, like, I was on the macro every day. Like if I have 300 protein, I'm eating 300, not 299, not 301, 300. My meal timing is 100% on point. Everything is just really meticulous. And you can only do such a good job with that. And at one point you're like, okay, well, there's nothing more that I can optimize. Now I just have to wait. So now what do I do with my time? Because I get hyper obsessive. And so I need something more to do, something more to do, something more to do. And so Paul O'Need is actually my nutrition coach. And he was like, dude, you need to just start going out. Like, just go out with your friends. Are you having fun? Like, you're stressed out all the time. Like, why don't you start going out? So then I actually, like, he penciled in homework for me to actually just like, and this was just like him and I as friends. He's like, man, I just want you to go out and hang out with your friends once this week. And I did it, and I had a fucking blast. I was like, oh man, that's really cool. So then I started scheduling time in my calendar to make plans with friends. And I noticed that because I was investing so much in this one area, I was just kind of neglecting other aspects of my my life. And so when I started going out more with them, I was happier. I enjoyed my life more. My sleep was better. My stress was down, which actually ended up enhancing the quality of my training, enhancing my sleep, enhancing my adherence to all the difficult things, even when I didn't want to. And so I really try and do similar things with my clients when, they're like, oh yeah, I have this coming up, but I'm going to try and, stick to my diet over the holidays. Blah, blah, blah. I'll just be like, look, man, I actually want you to like go and have fun. I don't give a fuck what you eat. It's the holiday. It's Christmas. Spend time with your family, And they're like, well, no, I really want to do this. Da, da, da. And I know them. They say that, but they're going to deviate anyways. Right. But it's better for them to deviate in a planned way than to be like, no, I want to stick to it and then fuck it up and then feel like shit about it after. So I'm going to be like, no, I want you to take that day off. I want you just to spend time with your family. You know, like when we train hard. So when you take time off, I want you to recover. Right. And I'll try and do things like that. Or, you know, if they're just like always stressed out all the time, I'll try and be like, hey man, like maybe do some like breathing meditations, maybe do some, I want you to spend some time with friends. I want you to go and do this. I want you to maybe try reading this book that you've wanted to read for forever. And again, I know that's a lot more personal. I know it's outside the scope of coaching and whatever. But like I said, I try and take a very holistic approach and really just treat these as human beings. And I've noticed that when I do that, their quality of life improves. And that really bleeds into their training output and performance. And so I think those things are interconnected. So there's, you know, managing the actual training itself, making it engaging, making it fun, having them see results, obviously is super important because that's pretty freaking motivating.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, I think there's a lot more that can be done too. So, I don't know. That's just some.
All right. So your personality then, right, is going to be more representative of the competitors that you're dealing with that are training for higher level goals, right?
My own temperament?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, because that's a completely different conversation than somebody that you're building training blocks for that really don't have a peak.
Yeah.
Right. So there's two questions here actually. So if you have somebody that you're training that's just, I don't want to say gen pop, but doesn't have a peak, there's not a meet, there's nothing like that, then how do you go about laying out the long-term training blocks there? In other words, is there going to be a peak for strength, or do you not have that block in there because it's not necessary?
Yeah. I guess that depends, because there are some times where, like, most of my clients are actually 100% of my clients are all like performance-based athletes, right?
All right.
I do have a handful of Gen Pop, but they're definitely on the stronger side of Gen Pop. So they're like, let's say in their 40s, early 50s.
Yeah.
But they're pulling like, you know, 450 for like 5 reps, and they're pretty small. They're like 180 pounds, you know, 190 pounds. So they're not huge. So they're pretty strong considering they didn't really do tons before. And for them, like, for instance, there's this one guy who he's in tech and he's, very, very busy. And so he's very disciplined and very dedicated with his training, but if he's got a product launch, like that might really mess with things. So it's like, we never really peak him. We just always kind of like build up to a point and then kind of bring him back down, build up to a point. We never really peak him like you were saying. Other people who are in kind of a similar position do kind of want to hit that 1 rep max. Like they're not happy with hitting a heavier triple than they were before. And so for them, we will kind of do a mock meet, but again, it's so dependent on like their work schedule and their kids and stuff. So it's pretty infrequent. I'd say maybe once a year, sometimes maybe twice for them. Are we actually peaking them and doing a 1 rep max? Just cause they're like, I just don't think I can do it right now. I got too much shit on my plate. So it's kind of tricky. But yeah, I'd say that's probably how I approach it.
All right. The reason I put it out there is, you know, me being a washed up meathead, right? So if I was working with, you know, body comp to be able to come down, say if it was Justin Harris or whoever I was working with, whatever that end looked like was a floating day, right? It moved. It wasn't a set date. Right? Because my life moves, it changes, right?
Yeah.
And then, so that was the first part of it. There was, I don't want to say there's no date entirely. There's a range, right?
I
There's
understand
a range.
exactly
There's a range, but it floated. And with the body comp, that made it a little bit easier there because it allowed for those weeks that things just weren't going to be able to be pulled in because of other outside factors that you try to control, but you just can't. And the other thing I would tell them from the onset is, yes, this is going to kind of look like a bodybuilder getting ready for a show, but I'm not doing the last fucking 6 weeks. Not doing it, right? That's where it's the least healthy of all. Like, I'm not doing that. We can go here. That's it. That's where that's going to be. Now, on the strength side, when I lay those things out for myself now, again, it's a floating target. So, because when I competed and it was a meet, I know what the process is. You know, come, 6 weeks, 4, 6 weeks, sometimes even 8 weeks out, here comes the shit that always comes. The little bit of the bicepial tendonitis, here's, there's the strains. It just starts to compile because that's just part of competing at that level. You try to mitigate everything you possibly can, but the best meet performance is usually done by the person who is the least dinged up.
Yeah.
But everybody's dinged up. I don't have to be, so if I start to get any of those dings up training for what I train for now, it's like, oh, cool. Deload, boom, let's change the block. We're going to push it. So whatever my strength objective is going to fall somewhere between October and January 1, somewhere before the end of the year. Things go cool, nothing tears for the whole year or whatever. Then it's going to come a little sooner, but I have the ability to push it out, right? It probably is, because if I had a meet, it's a different game. Because the way I am, it's fucking happening no matter what. Yeah. So that would be a terrible thing for me to do. So it's but I think that comes with my experience doing this for so long. I can do that and still know how to adjust the target. Where I guess the question I'm asking is, if the clients are coming in and they're newer in their journey, right? Do they have to have that date, of meet or whatever it is, to be able to be more compliant to what you're having them do?
No. So the two clients that I'm actually specifically was kind of referring to when I was talking, they've never competed.
Okay.
They just do mock meets. And actually exactly what you're talking about, where it's a little bit more of floating data. I've never really considered that before. It would just kind of be something that they would bring up, because we'd be so for the one, we were peaking him to test like a new 2RM, 3RM or whatever, but then I think it was like a new product launch or something was going on, and he's like, I just don't think I can do it right now. So he's like, okay, cool. So we just basically brought him right back down and kind of go into it. So it does end up being kind of the floating date. I never really thought about it before, like to put into words, but that's a great way to put it.
It's floating to a degree, right? Because I work in 3-week phases. So I can't like do a week 1 and then back out on week 2. It's like, I'm not going to run that last 3 weeks until I know this is clear, it's healthy, and it's good to go. Yeah. But I can move that 3 week. Like, this isn't good. This come down and move that way. So yes, it's floating, but it's not that floating, because I can't peak on a deload. I can't peak, what I'm saying? I can't peak at a time that I'm focusing just on GPP, body weight conditioning, and, all that. It's not going to happen. Right. It's still got to progressively build through blocks throughout the year. So there's that, where with everybody else you're working with, well, I guess the question I'm asking is, does the meet that they're training for keep them more compliant, right? So if they didn't have that meet, would the compliance drop? Granted, I know they're coming to you because they want to do a meet, but you get what I'm saying, because I
do get what you're saying.
That puts a carrot out there.
Yeah.
So is the compliance going to be there without the carrot?
I would say mostly yes, but probably like kind of in a similar way where if you're doing your bodybuilding diet, right, and you're going like the 3 months or whatever, but you're not doing that last 4 weeks. I'd say that's kind of the same, like, let's say mentality that they'll have, where, so if they're not competing, they'll push pretty hard and they'll do all these things kind of to a point. And then they'll be like, well, I've got 90% of what I want. I'm really happy. Let's just kind of pull back, and you know what I mean? So I guess I would say yes, a little bit, but I don't think that it's necessarily like detrimental. I think that they're just not squeezing out that last little bit, the last 10%, 15% or whatever. But then for the other people, where it's just like, no, you've got a meet coming up. It's time to fucking go.
But the reason I ask is I've heard a lot of coaches say, they absolutely 100% want all clients to train for a meet or to train for a show, 100%. And I never really knew what I felt about that, because I got a biased opinion because I got 24 years competing, exactly. So I don't have a perspective outside of that to be able to say if that's even a good or bad idea, because I could formulate reasons why it's a terrible idea. At the same time, it's the carrot. You know what I'm saying? And so,
it might not be though, right? So, for instance, if I'm being honest, I don't give a shit if my client's computer.
Yeah. I figured
it
that.
really. It's
yeah.
like
yeah.
you're getting me to do like provide a service. I'm going to provide that service.
Mm-hmm.
If it's you want to get massive like quads, but then you want your upper body to be tiny for whatever reason, as long as it's not going to like hurt you, I'm like, I don't give a shit, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But I also think that the people who aren't competitive, they don't necessarily like it's they have goals. It's just not personified by stepping on stage or stepping on the platform, right? So their motivations are still intrinsic, but they're not, it might be just the fact that they want to hit a certain PR on their triple deadlift or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
or they want to be able to, like, a lot of times they'll just want to do basic shit. Like I know my one client that I started with, when we first started out, his main thing was he's like, I just want to be able to play with my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like I'm out of shape. I want to play with my kids. My kids are getting bigger. I want to be able to lift them up and do all that stuff because they're crazy active. They dirt bike, they do all this stuff. And I want to be able to keep up with them. So that's what we started doing. But while we were doing that, he was also getting a lot stronger. And then he was like, oh shit, like I like this strength thing. Let's see if we can push that a little bit more. So we still have the goal of him playing with his kids. And that's still the number one priority. But now he's got these kind of other goals that are more intrinsic that don't necessarily have to do with anything about stepping on a platform or competing or anything like that. They're just, it's enough for him to still feel motivated and to keep pushing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think that really will make a difference in terms of, let's say I'm getting him to hit a top triple at an RP 8 or something like that. Maybe if he was competing, and I'm just going to throw out random numbers, maybe he'd throw 200 kilos on the bar. But maybe because he's not competing, he's only going to do 190. You know? So he's still adhering to the program, but he's not kind of like pushing as close with that red line as maybe a competitor
Mm-hmm.
would. So are his results going to suffer long term? I wouldn't say suffer. He's probably not going to get quite as far, but he's also doing himself a huge favor because he's also not putting himself at the same risk of injury. And he's also prioritizing his number one goal, which is staying injury free, staying healthy, and being able to play with his kids. So I think that you can still be very highly motivated without some sort of external thing, because it's part of his values is being healthy, showing up for his kids. And like we were talking about earlier, yeah, he wants to be a good example of his kids. Like a lot of the times in the videos that he sends me, his kids will just be like running around the background or like jump on his back while he's like about to set up for a deadlift. And so you kind of hear them talking. So it's like, I think that's more the stuff that is really what's driving him.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone kind of has their own thing. And so I guess you just have to find out what that is. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it does. It
Okay.
does. With here's an interesting conversation is over the past or over last year, because we're in a new year now, I've spoken to a lot of lifters, and probably more so in the past 12 months than any other time in my life, that had long-term programs laid out. So I would say in the quadrennial range, you know, so long-term. And it could be, you know, all-time world records, you know, highest level. And there's 4 I can think of right now that I spoke to about this. And they hit it, right? And then once they hit it, they're in this weird fucking place, right? Because a 4-year journey, and I say this because I think you're on a long, you know, quadrennial that you laid out for yourself, where some of the podcasts I heard earlier, you have big numbers that you wanted to hit. So this is a long path that may involve you coming down now to be able to rebound back up, to be able to get there. That's a lot of drive, you know, when this is where it is, then all these building blocks are building to that. It's hunger. If I get excited about it, it's like hunger, it's drive, it's like all of it. And then you get it. Then it becomes this weird fucking mental place where I know what I've told them. You know, what advice would you tell them? Because they're kind of like, well, here I am. So now I just keep repeating this, you know, and it's a different place. It's a place I don't know, right? Because I've never been at that place. But mentally, it's a completely different stage, kinda, right?
Yeah. So, sorry, just to clarify the question. What is my advice, or how
would you, if they're telling you this, right? So I just had somebody the other day tell me exactly this, right? Look, this was my 4-year goal, was to be able to hit these numbers.
Oh, so once they do, what's the conversation after?
Yes. And it's like
Right.
now it's a habit, right? actually it is part of their identity, which is kind of what I talk to them about.
Yeah.
But they're in this different place because they know at this level, they can't really build out a whole nother 4-year because they're not going to be able to put 500 more pounds on their total.
What are you talking about? Linear progression.
Yeah, exactly. At best, they're going to, chip away a little. And obviously they want to get stronger, but when you're talking, some of these people with records that are at their highest, I loosely say this, at their highest potential, are very close to, it's a different mental game.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ideally, I would have those conversations way up front, because that was something that I went to, and it's almost like postpartum depression, right?
Yes.
Where when I was boxing, after I won the Golden Gloves championship, this was like fucking ages ago, I became like very depressed because that was my entire life. And, looking back as an adult, I'm looking back and I'm like, oh, okay, I see why I was fighting and I see all these things. And so I'll kind of deviate to tell a little bit of a story to provide some more context about why I believe what I believe. So when I started fighting initially, it was because I hated feeling like a victim, right? I had, a handful of things in my childhood where, my family went through some difficult situations, and I was young, I was a kid, couldn't do anything about it, couldn't defend myself. And so I couldn't do anything. Then I was kind of growing up, and again, just didn't have great guidance, and I was just kind of weak. I was weak, I was scared mentally, I didn't have a great physique. I don't even mean just like my physical appearance, I just meant like, I just wasn't formidable,
What do you mean by that?
Like there was no threat. There was no threat of danger, so I couldn't enforce any boundaries. You know what I mean? Because like when two guys are talking to each other, there's kind of a measure of respect there, So like two guys are walking down the street, one guy makes eye contact, you nod, he nods, we acknowledge each other, we move on. If you keep staring at me, and I nod and you don't nod, it's like, okay, like, do you have a problem? Like, and I know it sounds like really stupid, but it's like, that's actually like an evolutionary thing, right? So it's like, I'm not sure if he wants to threaten me or he wants to do anything, but like now, at any rate, it's kind of going off tangent, but, so I was like, okay, I don't like feeling weak. I don't like feeling, like a victim.
Yeah.
And so I, decided to start fighting, and I started with jiu-jitsu and competed in that for a while. And while I was doing that, I was doing Muay Thai and some boxing. And then the club that I was training at closed down. So I just kind of started specializing in Muay Thai, and then fought in Muay Thai, and then went to boxing, and then fought in boxing. And I ended up having an aptitude for it. And so I would just train all the time. Like I would train 3 hours in the morning, go to work, then train 3 hours at night. I just did that every single day, 7 days a week. I did not miss a single day for like 7 years. I was just all about that. And I was like, man, like when I get to this level and like I'm gonna be good, and like girls are gonna like me, and the whole fucking bullshit spiel, right? And then you get there and you're like, my first thought after winning was, they probably weren't that good. That's probably why I won. They just weren't that good, And I was like, I was so depressed. I was just like, I went home and I was like, I don't even I've been working so hard for this. Like, what do I do now?
Yeah.
And so I went through all that stuff when I was younger. And now I see, like now when I lift, someone asked me not too long ago, they're like, well, what are you going to do, once you are like, decide you don't want to compete anymore in powerlifting? Like, you're going to keep training? Like, how are you going to switch up or they were asking me like how I'm going to switch up my training. And I was like, I'm not going to keep training. I'm going to go back to fighting. And they're like, what? I'm so surprised. And I was like, the things that I like about lifting aren't necessarily lifting. It's the fact that I get to get better at something. I get to, socialize with the people I care about. I get to do something that's meaningful to me. And so I connect with the behaviors that drive performance in powerlifting. So that's part of my values. And so a conversation that I have up front with someone who is talking about like, hey, I've got big goals, I will almost always just try and be like, hey, talk about it. What are you going to do after that? What's going to happen? Are you going to keep going? Are you going to do this? Are you going to do that? And try and pull them back and understand like the values of what they're doing. Like, because like you said, it's part of their identity. And if you reach that point and you don't have that level of like emotional maturity to understand what that's going to be like and how to navigate it, it's hard. It sucks. And so I think having those conversations is really important, because then it stops being about, this new world record or this championship or whatever it is. It's not necessarily as much about the outcome. It's more about like the process. And this is what's meaningful for me. It's meaningful to show up. It's meaningful to be there to support my training partners. It's meaningful to be disciplined, to stick with my diet, to have something that I'm really striving towards, and whatever other values other people might kind of attach to that. And I think when people start to connect with that more, the outcomes just kind of take care of themselves. Now, that's my opinion. I know other people are like, no, you have to have an outcome and you have to be, and that's perfectly fine, right? I think that there's tons of people on either side, but this is just sort of my perspective on this, where I've found that when I do that, I'm able to just focus deeply on what I'm doing in the moment. And I try and get a lot of my athletes to kind of do the same thing. I also try and pull them back a little bit. So I'll try and keep the planning, like we'll talk about that, but then I try and kind of keep that on the back burner. And only every now and then do I kind of like reach out and just touch base to make sure that we're still heading in the right direction according to them. And because goals change, people evolve, but I try and keep that stuff on the back end and just keep them focused on what's happening right now. Because I don't know that I have coached anyone who's reached that point and then had to stop, either because they were kind of, major injury, let's say, that forced them to stop, or they just like completely topped out their potential and they just couldn't get any better and they decided to leave. So I haven't coached anyone who's like that. I have coached high-level athletes and I have coached them in that respect. So maybe this is a little bit more theoretical, and maybe I'd change my mind if I had more experience with people who were kind of at that junction in their life.
It's, oh man, there's a lot of questions I have now. Because the obsession, with the boxing for all those years, right? So the concept of all in, right? So you kind of know what that is because of that. And at least a pretty good grasp, of what that entails, where in my opinion, most people don't, but at the same time, most people's all in is only what they know as their all in that they've ever done. So it's like trying to define hard work to somebody where they only know that as being the hardest work they've ever done. So with that, you know that. So as you go through this powerlifting journey, you know how much mental effort, energy, and all that goes into what you did with the boxing, right? Which for some people would scare them to want to do that again in something else, because it's all consuming, it's obsessive, and it means a lot of other things in the life fall by the wayside. Is it necessary? Is it not necessary? People are going to debate that forever, right? Some people are going to say it's absolutely necessary if you want to get to a certain result. Other people are going to say it's not, but usually those people never got to that certain result. So there's that whole thing, where the question that I have is, because you just said you wanted to go back to boxing, when the powerlifting thing's all done, is that a way to keep the obsession back some on the powerlifting? Because if you were to go all in with the powerlifting, granted, we try to mitigate everything we can possibly mitigate, but if you were to go truly all in, there may be a possibility you may not be able to do that, at the end. But because that's that end that you see what I'm saying? It's a fucked up thing to think about.
Yeah. That's tough. I think part of it for me is that I'm not a particularly athletic person, right? Like, I have much more of an aptitude for putting on muscle than I do strength, right? So, like, a lot of my friends are just insanely strong, like just fucking stupid strong. And they have a natural aptitude. For me, I'm someone who has to really, really, really try and pull all the levers. I can't just train hard and become really strong. I have to pull all the levers, the nutrition one, the stress management one. I have to get my hydration. I have to go to therapy, do all these different things in order to get pretty good results. And that's one of the reasons why I want to get back up to 290 is because I'm like, if I want to squat X amount of weight, that's my best shot, you know? And so knowing that makes it a little bit easier for me to leave, you know, because I'm not trying to break records. And actually, I guess this is one of the things that genuinely changed is initially I wanted the title. I wanted to be undefeated. I wanted all these things. And then I got all of that and I was fucking miserable. And now I never focus on winning. Like if I go and I compete, I'll usually just compete and leave. If I win, they'll call me, hey, you won, you didn't pick up your medal. I'm like, oh, cool, I won, that's awesome. And, you know, some people might say, oh, well, that's only because you're not good enough, you know, and that's why you don't care as much about the outcome. And you know what, that's probably right to some extent. I don't know, maybe it is. But the other element is I've always noticed that when I try and focus on the outcome, I never do a good job in the moment because I'm always focused. It's almost like when you go onto the platform and you load up a weight that you haven't done before and you get real nervous and you're like, okay, I got to fucking lift it. Like, come on. And you just amp yourself up. Well, you know what you're not thinking about? You're not thinking about your bracing. You're not thinking about your rooting. You're not thinking about your walkout. You're not thinking about the techniques that you need to execute to make that shit work. So for me, when I stay focused and I focus on what I need to do at the moment or in the moment, that gets me the best result. When I focus on like, let's fucking go, and I get really amped up, I always fuck everything up. Just always, you know? So I've noticed that it's almost like a way for me to just improve my performance by doing it that way. And because I think of things that way, it also allows me to maintain a little bit of a detachment from the longer term outcome. Because when I'm thinking about like, you know, I want to squat like 850 or something like that, or 900 or whatever, it's like, that's a big number, you know? And I know, like, it's kind of annoying because my squat's gone to shit now, but if I didn't have my head thing happen, I was easily projecting I was going to squat my 700 raw, you know, last year before all this nonsense happened. And then I was like, okay, cool. And then I had a plan that I was going to, you know, train a little bit more, maybe squat like 720, then toss on reps. I know that I'd be able to get a good 60 to 80 pounds out of it. So that'd bring me up closer to 800. And then, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then plus all the additional body weight I can do. And so like, I'm kind of calculating in my head. And I'm thinking about this stuff and, you know, I can see the goal for that, but it's still so far away that I don't really have to worry about it that much.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like my focus is I just enjoy the process. And so because I enjoy the process, it doesn't matter what I'm doing. Just so long, like I'm sure that once I stop powerlifting, I'm gonna fucking miss stepping under a bar. I'm gonna miss that fear of like, you know, I'm going to, but it's not gonna be as devastating, especially because I'll be able to replace it with something that allows me, it's just a different vehicle to express all of these things that are really important and meaningful to me. Like I like working hard. I like being busy. I like being productive. I like, you know, working towards something that's meaningful for me. And, you know, maybe some people look at powerlifting or boxing and they're like, bro, you're just fucking lifting weights. Who gives a shit? Stop taking yourself so seriously. But you know what? It means something to me. And maybe your relationship means something to you, but how is my lifting any more arbitrary than your fucking relationship or your job or you're this or you're that? You know, so I don't necessarily like how a lot of coaches will just kind of like downplay that. And so it does mean something to me, but it's what I get to embody through that process. That's what I really enjoy. You know, and hitting PRs is great, but like what happens when you hit a PR? You have this goal and you smoke it and then you're like, okay, cool. Now is my next, like, you don't even think about it. Like 2 minutes later and you're still not even thinking about it. You're now thinking about the next goal. So it's really short lived and it's a great process. It's a great experience. But I think that that's ultimately what has kind of allowed me to train in a much more, I guess, like mentally healthy way. Yeah. If that makes sense. Or else I just get way too obsessive and I get way, way too deep into things.
I think some of that could have been learned because of the boxing experience that you had, you know, because you look back and you can think, you know what, I didn't enjoy the whole process. Because when you look back after it's done, it wasn't that winning that was the fondest memory. You start thinking, oh man, it was all these other things that kind of led up to it, you know, the journey, I guess. But then with this, you kind of see the same trajectory and you can make that mental note pause, take in what's going on. And it's easier for you to understand that than if somebody just told you, look, dude, you have to enjoy the journey. Because if you're obsessed and you're on a journey, it's like, shut the fuck up. I'm just doing what I'm fucking doing. And this is where I'm going. Shut up.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where that kind of plays into with the awards that you were talking about. It reminded me of the first meet I did when I came to Westside, I believe was, the first one was a bench meet where I tore my pec, but that doesn't count. The first real one was I think the junior nationals or whatever. Yeah. And I had, God, I'd have to do the math, a decade of competing before that. And moving from Toledo to Columbus, I had a fuck ton of awards that I'm like, fuck, they're already broke. The little barbell broke off. So I just pulled the plates off, and had all those. And then when we went to the junior nationals, and I forget what I placed at that, but there was an award. And we're sitting in the lobby to be able to go back to the airport. And I'm like the only one with this award because I've always just taken the awards. And they said, no, the awards are under Tom's bed. Leave the awards under Tom's bed. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? We're leaving all the trophies under Tom's bed. So I went up there and stuck there's tons of trophies just shoved under Tom Waddles, who competed in that meet, just shoved under the bed. Yeah. And I learned, okay, we don't take awards here. That we don't, so it's,
really?
Every meet that I went to at Westside, with the exception of one, which my wife took the award for me at, because we would leave, before the awards. Because to Louis, it's not about that. It's not enough. So it didn't really matter. It was, all that. But to a lot of them, it was about winning, 100%. I wasn't that way, but most of the guys I trained with, it was 100% that. But I can't tell you for certain if any of them ever took an award. Because normally by the time they were giving out awards, we were the fuck out of there.
Yeah.
We were gone. And
that's such an interesting juxtaposition.
It was interesting for me, right? Because I was used to being raised that, and it was a different era, right? There was no participation awards and all the other kind of shit. But I'm not I'm not one to rant about that, because it's my generation and my age group that fucking were giving them out.
Yeah.
So I don't have the right to be able to sit there and to argue against how stupid and bad that was when it was my generation that did it.
That's actually a really funny talking point. Yeah, you never think about that.
No. And most people don't. And I'm like, shut the fuck up, dude. It's our generation that did this.
Yeah.
So keep that in mind. But anyhow, it wasn't. But I always saw it as it was a show of respect, to the meet director, because they spent money on it and all this other kind of stuff. So I didn't really care all that much, because most of the time, and a lot of the meets, even back then, they weren't stacked classes. Now, the ones that were stacked classes, those mattered, but a lot of the times it wasn't. And so when I came to that meet, and it's like, oh shit, these don't matter. This doesn't matter at all. But competing does, 1,000%. It was a big paradigm shift, because it became about something different, at that point in time. And I don't know where to go from there. It's just a different.
I don't want to put words into your mouth, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you kind of got to something that was a little closer to the root of why you're doing it in the first place.
For me, yeah.
Yeah.
For me, yeah. And at that point in time, I was on borrowed time, when I came there. So it's pretty much, I thought I was already done. So it was a different mental place I was in to begin with. So it really wasn't about that. It's just about, oh shit, I'm able to do things I didn't think I was going to be able to do. And it went from that long-term, this is why I can have that conversation with people, because I had that long-term plan, right? Yeah. Then I hit that and I thought it was exhausted. And then I had to find a way to stack more on it. And then it took a couple years, and it's like, okay, now I can quit being a complete fucking idiot, because when it's a bonus year, you'll do anything, right? And then it was like, okay, no, it's going to be more than a year or two. Yeah. This is actually going to be more years. Yeah. And that's when Louis pulled me aside on that one and said, okay, now look, we have to think about this differently. It's not about what you're trying to do here. And I'm like, I didn't think I was going to have this many, this many more years, so I didn't lay it out like that in my head, because I didn't think it was possible for what it was. And then there were also other conversations where fucked up or not fucked up, you know, it was kind of like, well, this is who you are, you know, and basically just leaning into the identity thing. Like, this is you, this is who you are. What the fuck else are you going to do? Right. It's a, you know, it's a fucked up thing to say, but it's the right thing to say for the person in that moment that's doing that thing. Yeah. Right. Because the last thing I want to do is to doubt that. Like, okay, fuck it. This is who I am. Let's roll. That gives me purpose here. Like if this was all about me just getting to this one place, then what the hell's next? You know, I don't know. Well, it's who you are. Oh, I get that. Fucked up. You know?
Yeah. It's funny when you talk about like purpose and motivation and all that stuff, because especially like in the fitness industry, especially in the evidence-based fitness community, which everyone always says that I bash them. And it's like, that's not true. I'm part of that community. And I'm a big fan of research. I'm a big fan of all that stuff. But sometimes there's like this disconnect between people talking about a fucking study and then what actually happens with people. And, you know, people talk about how like willpower and motivation, stuff like that aren't that important. And like, it's not enough. And it's like, you know what? The better you get, that shit matters exponentially more. Because you're already doing everything pretty damn well. You're probably already eating pretty well. You're probably already sleeping pretty well. Once you get to a certain level anyways. Now, I'm not saying that if you're at a certain level, you're going to be doing that. But if you're really looking to maximize your potential, you're turning over every stone. So it wouldn't be, you know, like just a wild assumption that they're probably already doing a lot of that stuff. And so at that point, it's like, okay, well, what else can you do? And that's where that level of like meaning and purpose and like what it means to you to do that fucking kicks in and becomes so freaking powerful. And that level of motivation becomes so important when you're at the top level. I think it's a lot more valuable to higher level athletes than it is to novices, because it's pretty fleeting. But I mean, anything you can use to get that extra little, you know, nitrous boost or whatever you want to call it, I think is so valuable. And when you have something that's like so meaningful, like, hey, this is who I am, this is what I fucking do, then all of a sudden it's not a matter of like, oh, should I toss more weight on the bar? You're like, I don't know, I might tear my adductor, but let's try.
Well,
you know?
Louis used to say there could be 100 rocks in the parking lot, you know, and the answer is under one of them.
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
you don't know what it is until you flip all those things, you know, to be able to know. Where in the cases, the most of the people that I'm speaking about, most of those boxes were checked, you know, and the ones that weren't checked were purposely done so, you know, either, you know, partying, drinking, or just stupid shit like that, which they knew, but wasn't there for me, you know. But it was, to them, all their boxes were checked, right, where they're really not, you know. There's always blind spots, right? I'm sure when I go back, and I can go back and really look at everything that I did, knowing what I know now, and I see where the blind spots were, but I didn't see those at those times. So all boxes were checked, right? So the only other box that I had to be able to push to a level I didn't want to go to is to be willing to die for what I was doing. Right. And that's where that level obsession goes to that all-in level obsession. That's at a different fucking level where you're completely okay with that. This is an okay option here, you know, because this is who I am. This is what I do. Right, wrong, indifferent. That's what it was, you know, and that's what it is for a lot of those athletes. And I think that sometimes, right, that those athletes need to speak to other people that have been there, because that's a different conversation than somebody that hasn't been, right? There's an enabler and there's a realist, right? Sometimes you need the enabler because that's the mindset that they're in. As fucked up as it is, you're not going to change it. You know, if somebody is willing to die for that and that's what they want to do and they're that ingrained with it, good luck trying to fucking talk them out of it, because all you're going to do is to piss them off and make it even worse. Yeah. You got to find a way to kind of like lean into it, get to their level, and then you're able to have different conversations about how what they're doing may be inhibiting their recovery, which is going back to things that I would have changed then, right? But until they know that, you're playing with the devil.
Yeah, it's funny how you talk about like the enabler and the realist. Yeah, because like, at the end of the day, people are going to do what they do. So it's like, okay, if you know they're going to do it anyways, why not just get on their side temporarily? You know what? I don't know if it's the best idea, but you seem really set. Let's fucking do it. that kid's buying. Like,
It's
oh
the
shit,
best idea.
he's got my back,
Yeah.
you know?
Yes.
And I mean, because you know he's going to do it anyways. So
Yes.
it's like, all right, cool, let's do this. You do it for a little while, kind of goes to shit, just like you thought. Hey man, you remember when I said it might go to shit? Well, looks like it went to go to shit. Or sorry, it looks like it went to shit. So maybe let's try this, you know? And then you can kind of be your realist. And
Yeah.
do all
Well, it's
that stuff.
trust,
But
right?
Exactly.
Where it's funny to me because people will always say in the industry, you need to meet them at their level.
They never do.
Right? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, they do when it's under what theirs is.
Yeah.
But they
exactly.
mentally won't do it when it's over what theirs is
Yeah.
because they think they need to talk them down from what they are to where they are.
Yeah.
You know, that's not meeting them where they are.
Yeah.
You see, you need to meet them where they are, wherever that is.
Yeah.
You know, and that's just a coaching component, which you're not going to find in the studies and the research and all the other stuff.
Yeah.
So that's not there, right? And that's where there's a lot, like you said, there's a shit ton there that is valuable.
Mm-hmm.
But some of these things are not quantifiable.
How the fuck are you going to study that? You know what I mean? And it's like you look at, so I was talking to someone about this the other day. I was like, okay, how many studies do we have on an SSB squat? Like what, 5? Okay, how long have powerlifters been doing SSB squat variations for? You know what I mean? It's like, I'm pretty sure the experts here are the lifters, you know? So, and that's not a knock at research. I just think that people sometimes don't understand that these are tools. And it's like, this tool is meant to be used like this. This tool is meant to be used like this. And when people talk about the hierarchy of evidence, they're like systematic review, meta-analysis at the top, you know, randomized control trials, blah, 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 and then anecdotal experience at the bottom. I'm like, okay, I'll tell you what, you gather all the PhDs you want, and then I'll get these 3 top-level coaches who have been there, who've done that, and give them 5 athletes, and we'll see who's better. You know, it's like I'm putting all my money on them 100% of the time. You know, not because the researchers don't know what they're doing, but they don't have the requisite experience to truly distill that high-level information into something that can be actualized in terms of like a performance standpoint, you know. And it's not to say that, sorry, maybe I overspoke. It's not to say that they can't. It's just you can't replicate experience.
Well, communication matters too.
You have to have that experience yourself in order to even understand. Like, I was talking to someone this the other day, and they were like, "Oh, do you take? Do you coach bodybuilders?" And I was like, "Look, I can put muscle on fucking anyone, but I don't know anything about like contest prep bodybuilding.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like." Maybe I make his delts too big and now he's all fucked up and he doesn't have good symmetry and then he loses. He you know what I mean? So it's like, I don't know enough about it. Even though I can build muscle, I can do all this stuff, I can diet him down. But what if he's on gear? I don't know anything about gear. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, not from a technical standpoint to advise anyone anyways. And so it's like, well, what do I do if he has like major GI issues? And that's a result of the gear. I don't know, you know? And so it's like, there's a limit to what you can do unless you've really gone through it and experienced it, either personally or maybe like through secondhand because you've been working with an athlete. And so you don't have that experience. And it's like, you're not going to find that in a textbook, you know?
It's the anecdotal there that you like, as I said, communication matters, right? Because most of the people that are in a strength sport are operating from that level, right? So again, you have to meet them at their level, right? So if you know everything that they're supposed to be doing and they're going to be better doing it, if you cannot communicate that to them at their level, then you're fucking worthless and so is your study. Because there's coaching matters, communication matters. So how's that going to be communicated to them? Now, that brings up the question of, you know, unless you've actually been there, can you coach it? And yes, I think you can. You know, where earlier in my career, I would have said, no, that's not possible. You know, it is possible if you have the background to be able to show that you've done it with others before and you know how to communicate with them to be able to do that, right? And that plays that huge role in there, where a lot of the times that you'll take the people that are pushing all evidence-based, they don't know how to communicate what they're doing to the population that actually needs to hear it. They know how to communicate it to their peers to make them look more impressive to their peers, or for more views, and that may be their goal. That's fine, but they don't know how to communicate it, you know, to that level. Some do. There are a lot that do, Mike Israel, there's a whole bunch of people that do. They
all those guys though are also crazy jacked or crazy strong. So it's like there's not that disconnect between the experience and their actual like academic background.
Yes, and I don't know if it's so much being jacked or strong or going down the path of trying to be
right, exactly, yeah,
jacked or strong, because not everybody is going to have that ability to be able to do that, but they do all have the ability to lean into it really fucking hard. I could even make the argument that the people that would be hard gainers but pushed for 2 decades might even be the better coach, because the best coach is the one that's had to overcome the more sticking points, or had to help other people overcome more sticking points. If you just right up there and never had an injury, you never got stuck at a certain weight or whatever it was, then what the hell are you going to teach anybody?
Yeah.
That's not the path most people take.
Yeah. So I guess I look at the starting point and then when they're at, right? So like if we were to compare, let's say, do you know Eric Helms? Mm-hmm. So if we look at Eric Helms, then we look at, what's his name? Jared Feather, right? Both have freaky physiques, right? Mm-hmm. Insane shape. Jared Feather's way bigger. Like, we know why, but I mean, even without it, he's also just like got better genetics. But you look at Eric when he started versus what he got up to, that's a big difference, right? So when I see that, I'm like, okay, you might not be as like massive as some of these other guys, but you clearly know what you're doing. You're demonstrating your ability in yourself and then also in your clients and your athletes you're working with. So, I've many times been like, hey, you should be skeptical of taking advice. Well, I posted this the other day. I was like, you should be skeptical of taking advice from, you should be skeptical of fitness advice coming from fat nutritionists, weak strength coaches, skinny hypertrophy coaches, and researchers who have no athletic background, right? I said skeptical. I didn't say don't take it. I said be skeptical, right? Which I think is like a reasonable request. And, a lot of the times people will be like, oh, so you're saying like, they have to be jacked. And I'm like, no. They're like, oh, well, how strong do you need to be a strength coach? I'm like, you're missing the point. The point is you require a certain amount of experience, right? And to say that experience doesn't matter is the equivalent of saying that education doesn't matter. Like I'm in education, it's what I do for a living. But at the same time, sometimes I think there's a bit of a disparity between, how these things are seen. Like, oh, you're just a meathead. You don't understand the science. It's like, you don't really understand what the scientific process is if you're thinking that his experience is not scientific, And so, again, research is a tool. Experience is a tool. All these things are just tools. And if you apply them correctly, you can get pretty amazing results. Like, I really struggle to think that Ronnie Coleman would have gotten better results if he would have just done like, an oblique pull around across his body to hit his lat more, I'm just like, pretty sure he did everything like as good as he could. Yeah,
well, the one thing that kind of blows my mind about the industry, especially over the past few years that we've all just gone through, is no matter what, any topic politically or whatever it's going to be, they're always going to say, look, man, the answer is always somewhere fucking in the middle, right? But yet, when they're talking about this, evidence-based and anecdotal, it's not in the middle for a big group of each population. And it's like, no, wait a minute. The answer is in the middle for fucking everything else that's being debated politically or whatever it's going to be, but it's not for this, and it's like shut the fuck up. We're making broad assumptions here, but there's a big, can't think of the word, a large number of people that are operating in that middle zone, right? And there's a lot of researchers that would love to be able to work with athletes of that level. How are they going to do that? Like what athlete's going to say, oh yeah, fuck, I'm going to give you all my meat prep and we're just going to do what you're going to do. It's not practical. It's not going to happen. And if it does, it's not going to be with high level, because they're not going to waste that meat prep to be able to do whatever they want to study. So it's limited by the nature of what it is. Right. And you're also dealing with sport, which is, well, how are you going to study? There's so many fucking factors. There's a nutritional factor, there's a stress factor, there's a recovery factor, there's a technical factor, there's a strength factor. There's all these different factors that all play into this. And we all know if just one of them is really fucked up, even if everything else is on point. So everything else is on point, but the nutrition is a complete fucking shit show.
Yeah.
Basically, they eat one cheeseburger a day and that's it. It all implodes, right? Any of those done at the worst level, it all fucking implodes. So there's a balance between all those spokes, if it's a wheel, that goes into play. How do you study all those?
Yeah. And that's the thing. Like, anytime you talk to someone who's like actively involved in research, you know, like I mentioned Greg Nuckols earlier, right? Like, dude is fucking smart, right? But when he talks about research, he really deeply understands it, you know? And then when you hear people who aren't necessarily as involved, they really tend to speak in absolutes a lot more. They are very certain of things, and they don't necessarily understand some of the practical limitations. And again, it's like everything is practical limitations. Like, so does real world experience. You can't, you know, it's like research is designed to answer a very specific question in a very specific context and understand that, you know, mechanism a lot of the times. You know, it's like, is time under tension better with this or with this? Or, you know, like, it's very, very precise. But then it's up to the researcher, it's up to the coach and the practitioner, or whatever you want to call it, to actually be able to take that and interpret it and be like, okay, here's how we're going to apply it to get better results in terms of athletic performance, physique, whatever it might be. And I think that disconnect, oftentimes, like, people don't necessarily make that association. Whereas, like, you talk to a guy like Greg, and it's like, he coaches. He was a very good athlete. And, like, he really understands these things on a very, very deep level. And so, you know, the people who are making these broad claims usually aren't the ones who are like actual experts. They're usually just kind of like the armchair experts who are, you know, making these posts on Instagram or whatever. Or sometimes they are just like legitimate academics who unfortunately are pretty disconnected from the field, but usually not, in my experience. Because, like, if someone's really, really like a hyper-focused academic, they don't really have time for like fucking Twitter or social media, you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of these guys are extremely necessary because we live in a meme world, right? Yeah. Where you see a lot of memes that will come through that will show research graphic or whatever it is, and they skew it to whatever they want it to actually say. And until you actually click through and actually, which nobody does, and then actually go and look at what it is, it's not that. You know, it's not what it said. Where I guess a really recent example was it last week that was going around the food chart thing, right?
Exactly.
Where, you know, at first I see that, I'm like, that's fucked up. And then I'm like, you know what? This is so fucked up. This can't be right. What is this? You know, so then you go look it up and you're like, oh, fuck. You know, that is why we need those people. Yeah. You know, 100%. To be able to push back against that crap, because you know that is getting fucking retweeted and reposted by everybody, because what percentage of the people are actually going to go look and see what that actually was? Few. Greg.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Greg, Lane Norton, you know, Mike Israel. There's a very small number
like four, maybe 5 people.
Yeah. So you see the fucked up shit, and as you either wait until they comment on it, you know, or you just go kind of finagle your way through it, or you just don't give a fuck. You know, it's kind of the best way to go about those, but they're 100% necessary, because that shit happens more often than not.
It definitely happens a lot, and that's why they're so valuable, because it's like they're really good communicators of research, but it always has like a practical element to it. So like even Mass, I know you're subscribed to Mass. I think you're still subscribed to Mass. Yeah. So like the research review, it's always like, hey, here's all this cool nerdy stuff. Here's what this means for you practically. Right? And it's
that's all I read.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But it's like that's the most important part. It's like without that practical element, you just have a bunch of random information, and it's like you don't really know how to act on it. It's like, okay, so we can basically train from like 5 reps to 50 reps between 85% and like 30%. Okay, what the fuck does that mean for a program? Like, what am I supposed to do now? Now it's even more complicated, right? And so, like, sorry, for hypertrophy, right? And it's like, okay, what does that mean? And then you read this and you're like, okay, so basically what this means is Here's some considerations. If you're going to push to the intensity side of things, if you're going to push to the, you know, the more higher volume, lower intensity side of things, and everything kind of in between. And so it's like they give you that application. And I mean, you know, there's going to be problems on every side, because it's like there was this one guy who he worked with a long time ago. I used to work at Gold's for like a year or something like that, a long, long time ago. And there's this guy there who was just jacked, like one of the most ridiculous physiques I've seen in person. And he was always like, oh yeah, I'm natural. It's like, no, you're not. I didn't say anything. So I was like, I'm not the kind of person to just call people out. But then he came up and physically asked me, and he's like, hey, do you think I'm natural? And I was like, me? What do you care what I think? And he's like, no, I'm just curious. And I was like, for what? And he just kept pressing me. So I was like, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll bet you $1,000 that if you do a test at my choosing, you'll piss hot. And he's like, okay, cool, let's do it. And I was like, all right, cool. And then he just obviously never, like, he just backed up. Yeah. I find out later he's dealing drugs to other people.
Oh, God.
And I'm like, okay, so you're dealing the drugs, but you don't take them? I'm like, I'm sure.
God, that's shitty salesman.
And then, and then he got busted anyways at some local competition or whatever and got stripped.
Yeah.
So I was like, yeah, of course I knew, right? But he had a ridiculous physique, and he was actually incredibly strong for someone who did not ever train for strength. He didn't even really know what carbs were. Didn't even know what glycogen was. Had one workout plan that he gave to, and I mean this quite literally, all of his clients. You'd see every one of his clients doing the exact same workout, doing these walking lunges up and down the thing, exactly after they did this and exactly before they did this, same thing. He didn't know anything. And he was insane. I was just like, this guy just has genetics of a fucking god. So as much as I do call out that stuff, it's mostly just because that's the world that I'm kind of living in. So I want to make it very clear. Like if I was on the other side and I was like, deadlifting like 950 and I was like, I look like a Greek god, then I'd be like, okay, that's probably what I'm going to call out a little bit more. So if it seems a little like I'm biased, it's because that's sort of the people who listen to me and listen to the stuff that I talk about. So just to, I guess, kind of clarify, because I probably should.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, to be fair in the discussion, there's a lot of that. Probably more of that than there is the researchers pushing on the other side. Way more. Of those people, they're stuck in whatever got them what they are at. I know people that are still stuck in the fucking 80s with their training, other ones that are stuck in the 90s, other ones that are stuck in, it's unbelievable, that they don't learn, from their experience or through the years, which I guess brings me to another question is, over the last couple years, what's one thing that you've had to change your mind on?
Man, so much. Like a lot, to be honest. I'd say maybe like 2 years ago. Before maybe 2 years ago, when people would talk about failure training, I was like, it's bullshit. It doesn't make any sense. Like I never, it's not that I thought that it didn't work. I just thought that it didn't present any additional benefits outside of training to, 2 to 3 reps in reserve. I was just like, it's excess fatigue, potentially your injury risk goes up. That's kind of what I thought. And so I was like, I understand it conceptually, but I don't really buy it, And then I started doing it, and then I was like, oh, this is what everyone's talking about. I get it now, So I changed my mind on that. So now,
well, when you said you started doing it, elaborate.
So I started incorporating like failure training into my like accessories. So it's not like I'm squatting to failure, but I'll do like a lat pull down, and I'll go to like a true failure. Or I'll do like a leg press or a belt squat to true failure, and I guess when you say failure, there's different ways of quantifying it. Because if you hit a 10, technically that's not failure. Concentric failure would be like an 11 or a 10.5 where you're actually failing. And so there's different ways to quantify it, but I would say like going to a 10 for me. So I haven't failed a rep, but it's like, I'm done. Like that's it.
Well, I'm more curious about, did you change the tempo and how you did the repetitions compared to how you were doing them before?
Yes. I started doing things a lot slower. I started doing things way more controlled, because I found that, actually, funny enough, it was almost like out of necessity, because when I was doing stuff before, I was just like, boom, let's lift weights, And so I was recording a video earlier talking about exactly this problem, right? Talking about output and intent when training. And I was guilty of that for sure, where I'd be like on the lat pull down, I'd probably use a little bit more like of my arching than I should have.
Yes.
But then the moment I started doing failure training, I'm like, okay, I really need to make sure I'm not, generating excess orthopedic stress. I need to make sure that I'm really targeting the muscle. So I have to be really, really dialed into my technique. So I do stuff and it really improved my technique actually. And then like I was trashed, but in a good way.
Well, it also changes your perception of what failure is, right?
100%,
because
yeah.
by just small tweaks in your tempo of contraction or range of motion, you can fail 3 reps. You can fail, if I said I want you to fail anywhere between 7 and 12 with whatever that weight is within striking range there, you could fail on any of those numbers that I told you based upon the tempo that you're doing that. Without that knowledge and execution of being able to do that, then how you're going to view failure is going to be completely different than the person that already knows how to do that. Yeah. Does that make sense?
100%.
Yeah.
And I mean, even exercise dependent as well, right? Because it's like, if I'm doing a bench press and I'm going, to here, well, if I fail, I'm probably going to fail at the bottom. But if I'm doing a lat pull down, I can fail here and I can keep going because this is a stretch position. Yeah. So I'm still getting a great stimulus here, even if I'm only doing, let's say, half a rep. So I can fail, from a technical standpoint where I can't pull it down to here, maybe I can only get it here, and then you can keep going. So you can almost do like, I don't know what you would call that, like an over failure or something like that, or some bullshit. So that was definitely something I changed my mind on.
So that's one of those topics that if I'm having a conversation with somebody about, I would have to ask them, like, how do you define failure?
Yeah.
Right? Because we're talking 2 different things. Because now if we're talking sport training, and how most people are going to train, then my answer is going to be, hell no, you probably don't want to do that because they don't know how to control the tempo. They don't know how to control those things. And no, you're not going to want to do that. By changing those things, then because then there's those other issues that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And try to do a set like you used to do to failure and see how that goes.
Yeah.
It's going to.
And the funny thing too is like, it's exactly like what we were talking about earlier, where you can't read about that in a book.
Yeah.
Like I've never heard anyone talk about those things that I experienced until I did it myself. And then I was like, oh shit, I can't be doing this. I can't be using momentum. I can't just be loading it up. And like, I'd never heard people talk about like, a range of motion failure before. Like no one really talks about that. They just talk about it in terms of like, can do it. That's it. And that's what simplifies the argument, which for me, when I heard that, I was like, it's a no-brainer. And if I were to keep it in that realm, in that like vacuum of an argument, I would still say that, not training to failure is better because that's what makes sense. But then the moment you open it up and you start saying, okay, what about if we're doing this? How about, if we can get a higher output with less volume, less orthopedic stress in your system, better recovery, all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, now we completely have a different conversation. So like, exactly like you said, what do you mean by failure?
Yeah.
I had no fucking idea what I meant when I was, making these like judgments from my soapbox. And so I think there's tons of things that I've changed my mind on.
Yeah.
Of
What
course,
was another one?
That's the thing. Let's say, of course, when you ask, I'm like, I don't know. I think another one is, really looking at like gut health. I mean, gut health has always been important and stuff like that, but I've never really experienced major GI distress before. So when people would come to me and they'd have gut health issues, I'd kind of have, like a certain protocol or whatever that I might design for them. And for the most part, it'd be okay. But then there are certain things where, you don't experience until you go through that like contest prep type stuff, where it's like, it's only in that really extreme type of dieting or whatever that like, that's not normal. Like you're not going to read about that in most places. Right. And so I wouldn't say this is something I changed my mind on. I guess it was just something I learned about through experience, where I was just like, I had major GI distress. Like I was bloated all the time. I was in crazy pain. Like I'm going to the washroom all the freaking time. And it's just like, everything hurts, and so I had to implement like a particular protocol. And then after that, I was like, holy shit, like this is super important. Like I really need to make sure that I'm dialing this in to make sure that like my nutrient partitioning is solid. Like I'm just feeling good. Making sure that I can actually eat all the food. Cause sometimes people will be like, oh, my stomach hurts. I just can't eat. Like, bro, you're a pussy. What are you talking about? Like I've been fucking full before. You know what I mean? But then
what worked for you?
It was like, I had a bunch of different things that I was doing, but the thing that made the most difference was taking glutamine. That was the biggest thing. I started taking glutamine, I think 20 grams twice a day. And that like within a matter of days, like instantly I felt better. I was like, fuck, that really helped. So that really helped. And then I kept with that, I think, for about a month. And then since then, I'm lower, like I'm leaner than I was even when that happened. And I still don't have any issues. So that was a big one. Like I said, not necessarily something I changed my mind on, but it was something that I just was unaware of. I think, it's one of those things where when you ask me right now and I'm on the spot, the only one I can think of is failure. Yeah. And then I'm kind of like, I don't know for anything else. Oh, you know what, actually? Bands and chains. Yeah. I used to not necessarily, many, many years ago when I would read about like the utilization, implementation of bands, I was like, I don't understand. I don't think that doesn't make sense. Like I'd hear people explain it to me. I was like, what you're saying doesn't make sense to me, But then when I started doing it, I was like, oh, I still don't necessarily know if it's beneficial for the reasons that I'm being told, but now I can understand the benefit for it. Whereas before, I never really used to use a lot of bands and chains or anything like that in my programming. And now I wouldn't say I use them a lot, but like I definitely use them in my program. I use them in a handful of my clients' program, and it's like incredibly effective. But so that was another thing that I definitely changed my mind on.
Well, something with that, because that's one that comes up frequently, is the things can be implemented, as we talked about earlier, for multiple reasons. Right. And two of the things that I put out more so with bands than I do with chains that most people never think about is when I used to train just personal train clients, Gen Pop clients, two of the things that were the hardest things for me to teach on the squat and the bench press, but just different means, as you'll see in a minute, was the ability to get tight before they sit down, to brace, right? So if I just put a light band, or not even like a mini band, on a broomstick, they are braced before I don't have to sit there and go through all this bullshit to try to teach them how to do that. The second one was to stand up with compensatory acceleration. Those two things, which are the hardest things to teach anybody, are almost automatically taught with bands. But that's not what the research will look at. They're looking at the accommodating resistance. And most people that are looking at the bands and the chains from a pro or con side only look at the accommodating resistance part. They don't look at that, right? Yeah. And that's a huge thing, where when I will throw that one out, people are like, oh shit, didn't think of that. Like, well, that's part of it, and now on the extreme end of that, I can also make the argument that if you put a whole lot on there, for an advanced powerlifter, it kind of actually becomes like two more legs, the bands pulling down, because it creates more stability. Right, yeah. So now you take them off and they can't be balanced because now too much, so it kind of falls into the air as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Because like if I'm learning from person A, B, and C, if they don't ever touch on that, I don't know, because I didn't hear that. I actually, one of the reasons why I started doing it was exactly what you said. I think I heard you talk about it on a podcast where you're talking about how you'd use that to teach rigidity. And I was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. So I was like, maybe I'll do it as like a coaching cue. And then I threw the bands on the squat so I could try it. And I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool.
Yeah. Well, most things in training don't happen in isolation, right? Yeah. But they will be promoted, written about, and described and talked about in isolation, right? Yeah. So let's take the dynamic effort method as another example. Tons of people are completely against that. So then I can come back and say, well, then are you against rest pause, right? Because if we're talking about, are you against cluster sets, right? Because we could say, now if we're doing 8 sets of 2 of dynamic effort squats and we're operating in a 1 minute or 30 to 60 second rest interval, then that's one very long rest pause set, of 16 repetitions over a period of time, so let's just forget about what you think it's for. And let's just say, okay, it don't work because of standing up with compensatory acceleration. That's bullshit. Let's say that don't work because of that. Yeah. But there are now 8 first reps, and actually when it's 2, there's 16 good solid technical reps. Because if you do a set of 5, usually at 3, you start to mentally break down again. Yeah. So, 8 sets of 2 with 16 total technical reps compared to 2 sets of 3, having maybe 4 total technical reps is 4 times more technical repetitions. So now technique doesn't matter, so there can, you see what I'm saying? There's different reasons that these things can be implemented. Not saying it's the holy grail. Not at all. I have people do 5 sets of 5, 3 sets of 3, and all this other shit too. But when there's pushback on certain things, it's not, like I said, it's always in isolation, and they're not looking at what the other things are, which for good reason, because a lot of the times, like I said earlier, just a second ago, it's promoted in isolation, which just opens it up to be tore apart in the first place. Where I wish people would, moving forward in the industry, I wish they would start presenting their ideas with more contextual reasons why the application could be beneficial. Does that make sense?
100%.
It's a hell of a lot more work, but it's going to create, I think, more understanding and better discussions.
Well, coming back to even what you were saying earlier about dissenting opinions, like welcoming dissenting opinions, because if I had heard people talk about, band work and stuff like that outside of just talking about it from a speed standpoint, that opens up the conversation drastically. Because when I hear people talking about speed, I'm just like, that just doesn't really seem to make sense with me, But then again, like compensatory acceleration training, like that obviously matters. But try doing that on a bench press. You know what I mean? It's like it's just not, at least for me, it's like, it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
So like when I have those bands, I'm just like, boom, and I can stay tight and I've got something to press against the entire way through. And you're like, oh shit. Okay. So now I'm really getting to know this is what fucking output looks like. Let's take away all the potential, physiological rationales and just say, here's how you work hard. Just knowing how to work hard in and of itself, independent of anything else, is incredibly important. That's what it's like to push with everything you've got. And it's like you said, it's like, oh, so that's not important now, and you talked about, first reps, like how many athletes, especially like, more intermediate novice athletes, their first rep is trash, and then second gets better, third gets better, because the eccentric element, all of a sudden they can stay tighter, right? But they can't create that off the first one. So again, if that's something to struggle with, and you just implement that, instead of having them do like, 3 sets of 5, they do 5 triples or however many doubles or whatever. It's like you said, you get more exposure to that specific technical aspect that they need to develop. And so,
no, but that's a really, really good counter if you're working with the beginners or lower intermediate, because that makes me think if I'm programming, if I'm working with somebody like that, then I want to just assume that the first 2 are going to suck, let them do the first 2, then stop, hold, and then start coaching the last 3. Yeah. And because that's going to reinforce more technical work, so it's again specific to the individual.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, like, I don't know. I've been playing around a little bit more with eccentrics, like getting a lot of my lifters to switch to like touch and go, but like a very light controlled touch and go. So if you're like, listen, you're barely hearing them touch the bar to the ground. They're just keeping everything there. Like just with a handful of my lifters, getting them just touch and then back up, touch and back up. And I found that's really helped them find that start position. Because if you're a sumo puller, you're usually going to fuck it up off the floor.
Do you have access to mono hooks?
Mono hooks?
Like the mono lift hooks that go into a power rack?
You mean the straps?
No, the hooks that kind of, so you can stand up like a mono lift would. It goes in a power rack. Basically they're just called like, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah,
sorry. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of it from the deadlift standpoint, but okay.
You would lower it and you got a top down deadlift. So if it's low, right? So now,
and then you open it up.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Because now you can start it there, right? Because the tough part of eccentrics on deadlifts is you got to fucking start it, so you still got to get it there. Yeah. But the slower soft touch is a way to kind of work with that too. Yeah. Where when I used to try to apply those to myself, it was, off pins in a power rack, and then you had to figure out how to lower it without hitting the pins, on the way down, for a top down deadlift, which is the eccentric. Yeah. Deadlifts there.
That's interesting. I don't know if the pins would go low enough for me. Huh. That's really cool.
Yeah. It's something that we realized a couple months ago with our mono hooks, on the rack down there. I'm looking at it, I'm like, no, wait a minute. These can go actually down low enough. And I'm like, well, I think all of them can. They all should be able to, they're attachments in a rack, should be able to get down there low enough. Yeah. Which that's why I asked, because I'm curious if anybody's messing around with it, because I haven't. It's just there. I haven't really had the opportunity. not the opportunity. I haven't had the need to have to put it in to help anybody that I'm helping out here at any point. I would love to just to do it, but it has to have a reason. You know what I'm saying? I have to have a reason to do it.
I think sometimes that was one of the reasons why I was sort of hesitant to experiment with bands and chains initially.
Yeah.
It's because people would be like, oh, why don't you do this? And I'm like, I just don't need to.
Yeah.
Like,
that's a huge,
my athletes are getting pretty strong. Like, I don't really run into any of these problems. But now it's like, now that I'm experimenting with more stuff, it's cool because you get more tools in your tool belt. But then at the same time, I'm like, I don't want to just randomly arbitrarily experiment, because things are going really well. I don't want to fuck with that.
No,
like, let's just keep checking the boxes. Everything's going great. Then if we need to make a tweak, then we tweak. So it's like, it's kind of this weird balancing act of like, I need to still learn and experiment, but then
you're a coach, man. You can't. It's other people's success is being trusted with yourself.
Right. Yeah.
You can't experiment just for the fucking sake of experimenting. Yeah. Unless you have a guinea pig group that's like, hey, yeah, I'm good to getting fucked up doing shit that may not actually do anything. Yeah. But that's normally not the case, and that's just the world that it is. It's just the world that we live in. You have to wait for the opportunity. But man, those are fun times, because then the opportunity presents, so you can think, okay, I know this will work, but what could I try differently that could have the same or better results?
Yeah, I've got one or two clients who are like that. So like, I like experimenting with myself.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's easy. Yeah.
But I also like, you just know, like, you do something and you're like, okay, this is how it's going to affect me in a week or something like that. So then you kind of play around with it. It's a little easier to tell. But yeah, I mean, sometimes it's how you find out like really interesting shit. In fact, sometimes you'll experiment with something and then you find something else that's completely unrelated to what you're even trying to implement, but that ends up being more valuable than whatever else you were trying to do. So it's like, it's pretty fun. And that's why I always want to make sure that like, I'm still coaching athletes. Like, I don't want to turn into just someone who's like looking at research, writing articles, talking about shit. Cause it's like, there's just so much stuff to learn. There's so much stuff that I don't know. And that's why I still listen to the podcast. I still read the articles. I still have a subscription to Mass, and I'm still always going to conferences and all this stuff. Because it's like, the more you learn, the more you're just like, bro, there's people out there who make me feel like such a fucking idiot.
Well, I know.
I know.
It's unbelievable, the vast amount of shit that's on. It's ridiculous. I haven't even looked at my notes one time. Is there anything on here that I didn't bring up that you wanted to talk about?
I don't know. Not necessarily.
Client-centered approach to coaching. We kind of talked about that one.
Yeah.
Variables and influence eating behavior, behavioral change, program design, designing nutritional interventions. Go into that a little bit more, the nutritional interventions.
Sure. So I'm a big fan of the behavior change model. So I'm just thinking about where to start. So
we touched on it a little bit earlier, but I want you to go a little bit deeper because I think it's super important.
Yeah. So BJ Fogg created this thing called the behavior change model, essentially. So if you think of like an x-axis and a y-axis, then you have this sort of like sloping line, right? So on one of the axis we have ability or competence, and then on the other one we have motivation, right? So essentially you want to select things when you're designing an intervention that are going to be ideally require low motivation, and then require low ability, right? So if someone's new or experienced, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change this approach. It just changes in terms of how it's being implemented. So for a brand new person, maybe getting steps is too hard for them. So maybe we just have to say, okay, instead of getting X amount of steps, you just have to walk around the block once, right? So that's low motivation and low ability requirement, right? Because it takes 2 minutes, and if you can attach it to a behavior they already do, then that's really easy. So let's say they go to work at 8 in the morning. Okay, great. Get up, go to work at 8 in the morning, but before you get in your car, walk around the block once. So it's already attached to something they're currently doing, so it's not adding any more friction. So the whole idea behind this is we want to remove points of friction, and we want to essentially make things easy for you to do. And now, if you're an elite level athlete, we want to do the same thing. We still want things that require low motivation and low ability. But obviously their ability is going to be really high, but what they consider difficult is going to be different. So You can tell me like, hey, I want you to do this, and it might be this very complex protocol, but because I'm used to that, it's not gonna be that hard, and I can execute on that, right? But you asked me to do that like 5 years ago, I'd probably fumble and mess it up. So you'll kind of scale it to the ability and the context of the individual you're coaching. So that's kind of the first thing. Then you basically, you have to create like a lifter profile. So when you're developing nutrition interventions, it's the same thing as if you're doing some sort of training intervention. You say, okay, like what are your goals? What do we want to do? Oh, I want to lose weight. I want to this, I want to that. Okay, like what does it mean lose weight? Like, are you looking to actually drop weight, or are you just looking to look better? You know, and then you kind of highlight all that stuff and really clarify all of those points. And then I would just reiterate it to them and say, okay, here's my understanding of your goals. This. I'm like, is that exactly what you want? Because if it's not exact, I need to really clarify that, because I don't want to be taking them in the wrong direction. And a lot of times people haven't necessarily articulated their goals out loud. I'm talking about novices, right? And so really need to make sure that that point is clear. And then from there, we just start collecting basic information. We talk about like their history. So what does your diet history look like? Do you have a history of yo-yo dieting? Do you have any sort of history of disorder type eating behavior? Do you have like a good or a bad relationship with food? What's your current level of ability? What's your current level of knowledge and education in nutrition? How many hours of sleep are you getting? What does your current diet look like? What do your training habits look like? What does your lifestyle look like? How often do you go out with your friends? Like, just really getting to know them as a human being. Because again, if a huge part of their social life is going out to eat, 2-3 times a week, that's going to be a problem, right? So how do we navigate that conversation? And so I probably would not start there, right? But you need to just really understand their whole broader context. This is kind of like you're creating that quadrennial plan, but you're getting all that information like really up front. And then once you have that, then you're like, oh, okay, this is basically how I'm going to start to progress things. And then you basically just start really fucking easy, and you start tracking behaviors as opposed to outcomes. So the outcomes are known. We want to lose 20 pounds. We want to, put on 10 pounds of muscle. We want to improve our performance in training, whatever the fuck it might be. But we start with something really simple. And you're always going to start with something that's like low-hanging fruit, really easy to accomplish, and something that requires the least amount of friction. Right? So I've had athletes who are like, oh yeah, I'm used to counting macros. I'm used to doing this and that. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let's just start with this though. And if you do it in 1 week, because you're telling me it's too easy, so let's just do it for 1 week. If you, after 1 week, you're 100%, then I'll progress you faster. But let's just start here, because based on what I'm hearing, I don't think that we should be there yet, you know? And then we do it, and all of a sudden they're like, oh, it's a little bit harder than I thought, right? Okay, cool, no problem. And then we start building up skills. And then each time I do that check-in, that little like video review or whatever, I talk about how they did. Hey man, great job. I noticed the previous week, you only hit your step count, 5 out of 7 days. But this week, you hit it 6 out of 7 days. That's fantastic. Then the next week, it's 7 out of 7 days. Then we increase it. And then, hey, you know what? Now, if we look back 5-6 weeks, you started only getting about 1,200 steps a day. Now, on average, you're up to about 7,600. We're not necessarily at that 8 to 10,000 yet, but this is exactly progress. So I always try and like look back and say, hey, these are the trends. These are the trends, really reinforcing like these behaviors matter. This is what's building momentum. A really difficult thing to communicate to people that you have to do up front, in my opinion, is talking to them about like reaching critical mass. So if you're someone who's never dieted before, and all of a sudden you start doing all of these dietary, new habits, it might not be enough. Right? It might not be enough to actually create meaningful weight loss. Maybe you're just doing enough to stop any additional weight gain, right? So you might spend 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, sometimes even more, just fucking getting into those baseline behaviors. And you're like, man, I was doing nothing and I wasn't losing weight. Now I'm doing so much and I'm not losing weight. This is bullshit. I'm just going to give up. But that's a misunderstanding of how that process actually works. So it's really important to communicate that, because then maybe week 7 or 8, now we have enough things going together that now the weight loss starts to kick in. And then once it kicks in, we add another thing. And now we start to see this exponential growth in terms of their weight loss results, or maybe their hypertrophy, or like, weight gain or whatever. Maybe we start seeing their performance really improve. So a great example of this is I have an athlete who he's studying for his PhD right now, and he's incredibly dedicated. But he's the guy you were talking about earlier where we got to fucking pull you back. Like, you're just trying to do way too much. He's like, hey, I've only got like 2 hours sleep, but and I was supposed to hit like a top single today. You think I should go for this or should I go for that? And I'm like, you should go to sleep. Take today off, come in tomorrow. Fucking call it, right? You know, or else you're just going to shit the bed and you're going to be pissed off. So for him, we really had to manage his stress and his sleep. That was the hardest thing to do because he's so busy. So, but we go back in his log and we're like, hey, let's look like a year ago. You were getting 3 to 4 hours sleep some nights. You know, his average sleep was like 5 hours. So he'd have like 2 hours sleep one night, 3 hours sleep, 9 hours sleep. It was all over the fucking place. But then after like several months and now, between 7 and 8 hours every day. You know, that took a year.
You see,
right?
When I'm hearing with this as well is, if you're going to reward the outcome of just the sleep thing that you were just talking about there, you got to wait a year to be able to say, dude, look, you're in a good place. Where if you're rewarding the behavior, you're rewarding every little tiny step that you're putting out there, which is going to build momentum, right? A year with no progress. So the example you gave of the person for 6 months, it's not really losing any weight and did all these different things. They're just not gaining weight. There's no reward. You know, there's no good job. There's no this. There's nothing that they can tangibly grab onto and say, look, I'm getting better. There's no momentum, right? Where if it is, you know, 1 serving of vegetables a day or whatever you're throwing out there, there's a lot of wins that build that momentum in that 6 month period of time. Because it all comes down to me, it's something that always comes down to momentum. Yeah. Like, how do you, that's the hardest thing to create, by the way, even in sport, whatever it is, it's the fucking hardest thing to create. But once it's created, you just, you know, you don't want to throw gasoline on it to make an inferno. You just want to keep that fucker burning for as long as it can, you know, until it goes back out.
Yeah. And it's hard to do that. So you every now and then you got to kind of pull them back and be like, hey, we're not ready yet. We're not ready yet. And like every now and then you can kind of let them, you know, push the gas all the way to the floor. But you know, during those times, another thing too is exactly like what you were saying about the bands. There's other stuff outside of just the physical weight loss on the scale. It's like, hey, you feel better. Hey, your performance is starting to improve. Maybe you didn't really care about your strength, but now you're actually really getting into it. And this is important to you. So we're seeing your PRs go up. Your clothes are fitting a little differently. Now you're actually too small for your clothes. So you haven't lost any weight yet, but you actually physically are changing. You feel better. You're happier with your decisions. You know, for a lot of women, and men, but I'd say probably more so for women, if they go off, like if they're dieting and then they kind of veer off their diet and they like eat like shit, they're like, oh, I am a piece of shit. I am this, I am that. It's like, hey, guess what? You haven't had any of those like yo-yo cycles. When was the last time? I can tell you right now, it was, you know, this date. That was 2 months ago. You were having one of those once every week. I'd say that's a huge win. Yeah. Right? So you're feeling psychologically better. You're more competent. You're more confident in your ability to like, hey, you know what? Like, I am different. I feel different. So I can do all these things. And like you said, all of that stuff combined builds momentum. So we kind of have to expand the definition. And now, sometimes, you know, you just start doing stuff and they just fucking drop weight like that, right? And so it's not like every client's like this. But the reason why I like to kind of frame it in the sense of like, this is a complete beginner, they're completely incompetent, is not because that's how most people are. It's just that those are the people who struggle, you know? So when you get those people and you just keep expanding what that definition of success is, and you keep reinforcing, hey, look, here's another win, like you were saying earlier, you build that momentum. And once you get that momentum going, then it becomes this really big intrinsic thing where you're like, oh shit, like I'm really enjoying the process. I really enjoy who I'm becoming. I love that, you know, I went out to eat with a bunch of my friends and they were all drinking and I was just like, you know what? I don't really feel like drinking because I have a session tomorrow and I want to lift really well. You know, I didn't tell them not to drink. They did. Because that was something that they wanted to do and it came from themselves. And I think those wins are really, really important as well. So I try and focus a lot on that. I try and focus a lot on the behaviors, but then also quantifying them. So I actually have like metrics that I'll track of, okay, how many servings of veggies did you get? That way I can actually like put a numerical value to it. So it's not just, you know, oh, I think you're doing better. It's like, no, this is demonstrable proof that you are doing better with your adherence on all of these things. And we know that if you just continue going, you're losing weight, you're getting trimmer, you're feeling better, blah, 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 the weight's going to come off. And then again, once they reach that critical mass, it's just like their weights, everything just kind of takes off.
One thing I didn't talk to you about is the warm-up strategy, where did that change when you became a part of Kabuki?
Not really. But only because I was kind of doing that stuff before.
Okay. So what caused it? Well, how was it before? Then why did you change, and how did you change?
I was just always getting fucking hurt.
Yeah.
you know? So my hips are just always banged up. Like I'd squat and it'd just be painful. My shoulders would get really jacked up. And I was just like, man, like this sucks. And I would just do longer warm-ups and do all this stuff. And it was just like, nothing was really working. And so how I changed it, I guess, was kind of twofold. The first thing was I was kind of making the same stupid mistakes that everyone else is. It's like everyone knows what they should be doing. They just don't do it.
Yeah.
You know, one, I wasn't actually increasing my core temperature. A lot of people warm up, but they don't actually warm up. They'll just like do stuff. And they're like, okay, I've done my, band pull aparts. I've done my bottom up kettlebell, whatever. I've foam rolled and all this stuff. They're not doing anything to actually prep the tissues. And the second thing is, I was doing stuff that was specific, but I think the big thing was just like the warm up. And then I wasn't trying to actively create a buffer. I was more so just kind of preserving what I already had. But the problem was that I didn't have a buffer.
Yeah.
So
detail what you mean by the buffer.
Right. So if I'm getting into, let's say, a deep
you're good.
Deep bench press position, there's certain requirements for internal external rotation during exercise. So if I'm getting here and then my tissue tolerance is not very good because I just don't have the active control or anything like that, or the mobility to go deeper while maintaining my position, I'm going to have to access that range of motion from somewhere, right? Whether it's scapular elevation, whether it's, rotation of the shoulder, whether it's collapsing of the chest, whether it's, pushing the bar closer to my whatever, So you're going to find a way to access that range of motion to execute the task. Unfortunately, that'll put, but it can change how load is being translated through your body, and then how you're generating force through your body into the implement as well. So for me, that just meant I would bang my shoulders up all the time because I just didn't have good shoulder mobility. So what you want to do is, if this is your requirement for internal and external rotation, and this is your tolerance for loading, you probably want to create a bit of a buffer so you can actually get into end ranges even larger than that, so that you have that kind of safety net, right? It's the same reason why I'm a big fan of doing Jefferson curls for myself, is because when I do that, I feel like when I'm lifting in position, if my position starts to break down slightly because I'm at like a max top end load, it doesn't feel bad. I'm not like, oh shit, I'm going to get injured tonight. Like when you're doing a deadlift and you start getting out and you're like, uh-oh, right? That helps protect you to some degree. So there's an injury risk management element. And then there's also just like an efficiency element where it's like, now I'm able to actually execute the movement better. Beyond that, it helped me just not be in pain when I was training. Because like when you're in pain when you're training, it's just like, you can't even push because you try to push, you're just like, in your shoulder. So it was always just kind of derailing me. I could never, like you were saying, I could never build that momentum. Like I would get it. And then once I reached kind of a certain workload, it would just always come back because I never addressed those issues. So that was the main reason why I changed. Now, what I did for those changes, I guess, is two-part. The first was I started adopting more aggressive warm-up routines. I would only do about a 5-minute warm-up. Like when I switched, I started only doing about a 5-minute warm-up, but I would choose 3 to 4 different exercises. And actually, I recorded a video earlier with you guys on this. So I do 3 to 4 different exercises. They would be specific to what I was doing on that day. So for bench press, I might do like some cable pullovers. I might do some bottom up kettlebell press. I might do some push-ups. And then maybe another movement, maybe like a quadruped rows, right? So I'm integrating rigidity through the core, shoulder stability, scapulohumeral rhythm, but I'm also doing them all in a circuit very fast with no rest. So by the end, I'm huffing and puffing and I'm sweating, right? So I've checked off those 2 boxes. Then I get into my lifting. I fucking feel great. Like my shoulders feel like butter, right? So that's the first element, is enhancing like my warm-up, making it a good quality one. The second thing that I was doing was I switched to a lot of my rehab, prehab stuff is actually built into my program, right? So it's not part of my warm-up. It's actually my program. So I might do like a Cossack squat or something like that, because that's going to open up my hips. It's going to help train, abduction of my hip, because it's kind of one of the areas that I'm weak. It's going to put me into that deep angle of hip flexion and ankle flexion and knee flexion, and keep me really stable. Because again, sometimes where I would struggle before was at the bottom. Like most people, you kind of lose your bracing at the bottom. So now I get to be put in that position, really feel stable there, control that position, and then come out of it. So you sort of learn to dominate those end ranges. So for me, I would do that. And I found that once I started implementing that, my sumo, one, it was easier to warm up. I just felt better in general. Two, my sumo, my squat, everything just felt way more stable. So now I can push at higher outputs. So even though, you know, and I'm just going to use this for myself, maybe it doesn't affect other people, but the Cossack squat for me is really great. So even though that doesn't directly translate to increasing my 1RM on my squat, what it does is it indirectly is going to increase my output in my training, which will ultimately increase my 1RM down the road.
So where are you putting it in your training day?
At the end.
Okay.
Just as like a supplementary or kind of an accessory exercise, just like right at the end. You know, for shoulders, I might do something like some like pullover, right? Or like shoulder extensions. So, you know, powerlifters suck at doing that movement basically, especially like larger guys. My mobility's improved quite a bit since I lost like 50 pounds, which is nice. But there's a lot of stuff there that I just couldn't do. And then, you know, I was working with Cass. So Cass is a coach, but she also has like a physical therapy background. And so she gave me a couple exercises for my shoulder. And so I've been doing a lot of that stuff. But again, just do it at the end, right? So I do it at the end, push it to fatigue. I push these exercises hard. It's not this like lame, you know, just, oh, I'm just doing some like banded work, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you're pushing this exercise hard and you're getting load in those positions, because then you'll develop positional tolerance and you'll develop, just better resiliency in those end ranges, right? And you're looking for an actual adaptation. If I'm just doing stuff, I'm never increasing load, like you're looking to progress load on these ones, or at least on a lot of them. So consider it like training, consider it like a dumbbell bench press, consider it like a, you know, lat pull down, like you're wanting to progress volume or load or something, right?
Yeah, no, I like that. And that's how I've always implemented it myself, because the way that I thought some of those things that you're talking about, I never wanted to put those into my warm up because I didn't want to fatigue the things that would be at the greatest risk with the heaviest load.
Exactly.
Where that warm ups, as you just explained, it's a different entity of the whole thing. But when those are limiting factors, they need to be trained so they can have that adaptation. You know, and sometimes in the warm up, they're not trained to a point that can actually have any adaptation. You're just moving.
Yeah. Yeah, because exactly like you said, and that was something when I was like, okay, I got to take my rehab seriously, I did exactly that. I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it as part of my warm-up, so I'm ready. I get there, and I'm like, I done rack a bench. I'm like, my shoulders are fucking gassed. Like, I just feel done, you know? And then, the rate-limiting factor becomes more of a rate-limiting factor. So you're kind of doing yourself, like, more of a disservice.
Yeah.
So, I found that when I started implementing that type of an approach to programming, I feel really good. And I do that stuff a lot with my athletes. And I mean, you know, they'll be like, oh, I strained my back, or I'll, you know, strain your adductor or whatever it might be. But they don't really have like tons of really serious injuries, you know, knock on wood. Right. I think this metal actually.
Metal. Yeah.
But yeah, I found that it's incredibly helpful for building up that sort of buffer. And so I can push them a little bit harder. And I don't need to worry about them getting injured as much, because I know that they're stable. I know that they're strong. I know that they're good in those end ranges. So it's like if, you know, you see that guy who fucking tore his pec on the incline with Larry Wheels or whatever, he can't even get the bar down to here. And you're putting 400 and trying to get him to go that much further. It's like, I think that's going to be problematic.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, you can see that happening before it even happens.
Yeah, exactly. So I've never watched the video, because I never watch those things anytime but I know of it, right?
Yeah.
And so I did see him warming up, and then my buddy's like, oh, watch Lee tears his pec. And I was like, nope. So I just walked off. But so that's typically how I'll approach those things.
With your athletes with back, how do you mitigate the lower back?
A lot of it, honestly, is through just effective workload management and good bracing, right? So I'll always try and focus on my bracing. So if I feel like someone's, you know, more focused on moving the weight, so, you know, let's say they have a heavy double to do, they might be, you know, like, you're more like, okay, let's fucking do this, right? And you might kind of move into a compensatory pattern that feels comfortable. So to kind of mitigate that, one of the things that I'll try and do is maybe implement some tempo work, right? Where it's like, okay, now you got to move slow. So you still are working really hard from like a relative effort standpoint, but you're moving in a way that allows you more time to really feel the movement and dial in like some of the technical aspects. So I would say like exercise selection is a big one, which includes like the tempo and the execution of those exercises. Just overall workload management, probably the most important one.
Yeah.
But a couple ones that I notice as well that are really important is like stress, hydration, sleep. Those three are really, really important. I'd say those come up a lot more often because I think most people, if you're a coach for a long time, you know how to program, you know how to coach them from a technical standpoint. And so I'd say those three are probably more often the culprit, where they didn't really get a good night's sleep. They're a little bit dehydrated and they kind of push a little too hard in the gym. So
one of the things that I would add to that, and it's something that I was aware of when I was still competing without even knowing I was aware of it. Oddly enough, like I would look at the competitors, you know, and just the sport in general, and be like, okay, what are the most common injuries? Pecs, knees, low back, right? Yep. And I already strained my pec 1 year out of high school, so I'm like, I'm fucked here, right? So it's mitigating, but this is a road I'm not really good at navigating. Yeah. So I had to figure out just how to mitigate that the best I can, which I didn't do a great job because I tore both of them off. But but the lower back and the knees those are like career enders, you know, from what I was seeing. It's like, fuck, this is going to kill me. It's going to knock me the hell out. Where knees, fortunately, I never really had a big problem with, but I was wide and sat back. So it kind of alleviates a lot of that that's going to be on there and puts more on the posterior chain and glutes. 2 hip replacements. So maybe that was the compromise for that. And then the lower back, I can remember straining it, you know, a couple times, and you know, you're like bending over, pick up a laundry basket or whatever, and pop, and you're like, fuck, I don't know if you've ever had that experience, right?
It's always that happens.
Okay. So so everybody's had that experience. I'm like, okay, what I noticed back then was I couldn't lift things the same way when my back was jacked. Like I had to squat down, I had to get out of bed differently, all these things I had to do differently, which they call now sleep hygiene or back hygiene or whatever it's going to be. Right. So basically, you know, most of the habits that people do is just tearing the scab, you know, the low back. Like, how do you get out of bed? How do you stand up from a chair? You know, people do this twisting, fucked up shit instead of just standing up as you would if your back was jacked, right? So if you strain your back, how are you going to get up out of the chair? You're not going to, because it hurts like a bitch, right? You're going to put your hands on your quads. You're going to stand up. You're going to get out of your car a certain way. All those things I did consciously for a long period of time because I didn't want to fuck my back up because it would fuck my training up. And I knew that was the thing. Like anytime I talked to any washed up guy, you know, why they retired. Oh, my back, dude. It was always that. And I find out later, most of that's just bullshit. Yeah. You know, but back then I'm believing it's like, okay, everybody can't do this, this, and this. And I try to put out there as much as I can the importance of that, you know, and when Brian Carroll fucked his back off, I don't know how much you know about the story, but he broke the shit out of his back, and he was a sponsored athlete at the time, so I'm seeing all this. Actually, before all this, I don't know if he wants me saying this, I'm seeing the fucking injections he's taken every week just to be able to train. It was on a weekly basis, so I don't know how many days out it was before it squat. It's cortisone or whatever he's every week to be able to train. It's like, dude, this is not a good fucking idea. Yeah. And so the text, you know, the interesting text messages we'd have at the time, because it's like, dude, man, I'd have like a week where it's like, it's probably time to think about hanging it up. You know, then the next week's like, fuck it, man, just go. You know, just kind of going back and forth with that whole thing. But he ends up destroying the shit out of his lower back. But the one thing through a story that impressed me the most, which isn't really part of where I'm going here, was after he started hooking up with Stu McGillen. I think he's going to be, you guys have a thing going on next week, right? Is he part of that?
I don't think Brian is.
No, Stu.
I don't know. I should know. I'm the one who
you should know.
Everything.
Anyhow, you guys...
there's like 50-something people. So
Yeah. Okay, so do a quick plug. They got what do they call that? The
Kabuki Education Week.
Kabuki Education Week coming up in February. And there's like a whole week, you know, of presenters. Yeah. I think Stu was on there before, which is why I'm thinking that. He may or may not be on there. Anyhow, that's part of that. But when Brian started working with Stu, one of the first things he told him was don't train for 6 months. I'm like, this is never going to happen. I've never known anybody to do this ever. And he did. And I'm like, holy shit. You know, that, you know how people talk about all in? Yeah. That showed me this person's all in, because people conveniently use the term all in to either support drug habits or all the other things that they want to do, but they inconveniently avoid it when they want to talk about sleep, nutritional habits, and, you know, the other things that they should be doing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, it's funny. Actually, it's so true. So literally yesterday, I was texting with a buddy of mine, and he's like, yeah, you know, I'm thinking about getting on test or whatever, blah, blah, you know. And I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of cool, whatever, right? He's like, yeah, you know, just like for health and this and that. And I'm like, what health benefits? And he's like, well, you know, like I heard it like helps people with their psychology and they just feel better and this, that, and the other, they have more energy. And I'm like, yeah, if you're deficient, right? And to clarify, this dude's in his early 30s. So it's not like he's like 50 something, 60 something. And I'm just like, dude, just say you want to get jacked and juicy. I was like, that's fine.
Yeah.
You don't need to tell me anything. Like I don't give a shit what you do. And he's like, well, no, yeah, I know it is for that as well, but like it's mostly just for this. And I'm like, do you have low T? And he's like, well, I'm on like the lower end of normal. And I'm like, oh, so you're still in the lower end of normal though. Like it's normal. He's like, yeah, well, I'm just a little concerned. I'm like, dude, you're jacked. You're super strong. I think you're fine. Like, if you want to take it, just take it. I was like, just don't fucking bullshit me. And then he's like, yeah, okay, you're right.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like,
they're just bullshitting.
So it's very funny that you're saying that because it's so true. And like everyone does it too, but doing nothing is honestly so hard.
Yes.
So fucking
no, it
hard.
is super hard.
Like that's real discipline. Like you were saying, the 6 months off thing is very difficult, especially if he didn't just turn into like, you know, I don't exactly, because I know what happened, but I don't know all the details. But especially if you have to take time off and you don't turn into a piece of shit because of it, like you're just like, well, fuck it, you know?
Yeah.
And you're actually doing what you need to do. Like that is,
I mean, he had
like
to,
super
you know, to be able to let the bone heal, you know, and let the whole thing heal, which, you know, and then part of that whole thing and, you know, following him through that process was he was able to bring a lot of these things that I'm talking about, you know, like how you move, how you just things that you do outside of the gym that's wrecking their backs without them knowing it, sleeping on their stomach, you know, all kinds of stupid shit like that. Able to bring that into the conversation to be able to help, you know, a lot of the people that are dealing with it or avoid a lot of it, because it's the one thing I think him and Stu were able to do was to show that most of the problems that people are having probably aren't happening in the gym. You know, they're happening outside the gym with all those type of things. And, you know, when they put together The Gift of Injury, which is the book that goes into Brian's story, but also goes into all those different things that helps reinforce that, because I can't count. I mean, you know, the number of people, and sometimes you don't know if it's real or not, you know, so they just make shit up. The number of people that have back issues and you try to help them. Like, hey man, you should probably not do this and try to do this and try to do this. And they don't fucking ever listen. Right? I have this a lot where I keep like 10 copies of this damn thing in the office over there, because then I can say, here, take this. I swear to God, I'm not lying. They're over there for that reason.
I believe it 100%.
Because it's not that big of a book to read. And then I also know that if they're really serious about it, they'll read it. If they're really serious about fixing it, if all they want to do is to use it as their excuse as to why they can't continue to do something, they're never going to read it. You know, now that's getting into that weird psychology stuff we were talking about earlier, where some people, I think, want that out there as their reason why, you know, they can't do things. And, God, that's a whole nother rabbit hole, you know, to be able to go down.
Yeah. Well, it's funny too. So the one thing that I will say about, this, and I guess like I'll preface this by saying like I'm not a physical therapist or anything, but when it comes to movement outside of your sport, when you become more fit, your risk of injury can go up when you start doing other shit, especially if you're really strong, right? So like I went back to boxing last year at some point, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to start messing around. I'm going to go real light, not do anything. I go in there with my buddy the first day, because like I'm still fast and I still have power, because like, you know, I got to a decent level. And so you don't, even though it's been like 10, 11, whatever years, right? Like I can still throw a punch. I can still move very explosively. But how often does a powerlifter train in a rotational plane? fucking never,
Yep.
you know? And so at best, most of the time, you'll just see an anti-rotation element, right? So like a pal-off press or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But usually they're not doing a whole lot of training there. And so I'm in there and I go to like fake across, and then I come across with just like this tight hook, and that counter rotation, that extension, boom, I tore my fucking oblique.
Yeah.
You know, we're not even sparring with power. We're just going fast. We're just going fast and light. And I tore my freaking oblique, and I'm 2 weeks out from nationals. And I was just like, awesome, this is great. Yeah. And so like, I'll explain that to people where I'm like, if you're strong and if you're big and whatever, like you can generate a ton of force, but if you're not prepared to translate that force in different joint angles and load vectors, you can be in trouble. So, you know, like, you want to go for a run, you want to play rugby, like, hey, that's great. You can go play rugby, do all that stuff, but fucking ease into it.
I'm so glad you said that.
Go hard. Like, and so after the injury or whatever, I pulled back, obviously. So, okay, I need to get better for nationals, right? And so luckily I was, and we did a really, really aggressive rehab protocol on it, and I squatted. It didn't really hurt that much, and I was able to lift, right? But then when I'm back into it, I made sure that I took a good 8 weeks before I was even hitting with 70% power. Mm-hmm. Everything was just slow and just light, just touching. And like, even like, I didn't even go back to skipping. It took me about 7 weeks to build up to actually skipping. I would just kind of like, I'd do a drop, and then I'd step up on the box, drop, step up on the box, drop. That was enough for my Achilles tendons, right? And the next, you know, I'd progress it to drop, jump, drop, jump, drop, jump. And then I progress that to just kind of doing like some little reactive jumps where you just go boom, boom, boom. And then after, you know, another like week or two, then I first started doing skipping, but I did it for 30 seconds on, 1 minute off. And then so it took me like 8 weeks to be able to do longer than 8 weeks, to do a full round, like 3 minute round of just skipping.
Yeah.
You know? And I'll tell that to people and they're like, why? I'm like, because I didn't want to get fucking hurt. That's why.
No, I think it's important that you told this story, because it's the one question people need to learn how to ask if they're at a competitive level like that is to ask like why and what's the reason. Yeah. Because it's or why and what's the worst outcome that can happen. Because how many times I've heard people say, man, I fucked my hamstring up. Well, what did you do? Well, I was sprinting with my girlfriend in the parking lot. Yeah. Why in the fuck were you sprinting in the parking lot? Yeah. Well, she thought she was faster. Who gives a shit?
So common. That's so common. That exact example, I've heard that a million times.
Now, if they would just pause, right, and say, okay, why am I doing this? What's the worst outcome? Well, torn hamstring. Like, do you really want to tear your hamstring doing that? You know, now if the why can be answered correctly, then you do what you were talking about. How do you prepare for it to be able to add it into your program, you know, for whatever reason you want to have it in there, if it's fun, whatever. But it's going to take some preparation, just as you can't go in fresh from doing all bodybuilding work like you've been doing. You can't go in from doing all bodybuilding work, and then when that's all over, the first week back, you start doing heavy singles. Yeah. We all know that. Yeah. You know, so how's that really any different than, hey, man, I'm going to go spar when you haven't done it for years?
And that's the thing. I think especially when you look at it, you don't really take it that seriously. You're like, oh, it's just running. Like, it's not like I'm squatting, blah, 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 amount of weight or whatever. You're just, and so you don't really take it that seriously, but then you're like, okay, but let's say you can squat 700-800 pounds. Now you go and you start sprinting. Do you know how much force you're generating per strike?
Yeah, I didn't even think about it.
It's absurd. And it's like, when was the last time you were generating force in those positions, you know, and that rapidly too? It's like, what's going to happen to your hamstring? And so I was very lucky, actually. So I was running with my girlfriend at the time. She was like, so she was a runner and she was a competitive runner. She did track and all this stuff. And she was like, oh, I'm faster than you. And I was like, I doubt it. Like, I used to be pretty fast. And anyway, so we were just like out for a walk somewhere, and she's like, okay, I'll race you. And I was like, okay, fine. So we set up, and then I go, and I just am like, boom, I just freaking blow. Like, I mean, obviously I'm going to beat her, but like, I was shocked at how fast I was running, and I immediately stopped. And she was like, why'd you, she just blew right past me. And she's like, why'd you stop? And I was like, nope. I'm like, I felt like I was ramping up to maybe like 40%. And I already felt like there was just so much power that I was not using. And I was like, no, I know that if I go any faster, I'm going to fucking tear my hamstring, my quad, my something. Because like I just felt like I had so much power to generate. And I was like, I'm not risking it. So I just stopped. And like, I mean, maybe I wouldn't have gotten injured, but maybe I would. And how stupid would that be? You know? So I was just like, I always, if I'm doing something else, I always try and like really take my time easing into it. Because it's just like, it's just not worth it.
Man, I love having you out here. I've learned some things. You reminded me of some things. It's been great having you out. You're doing great things.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Honestly, it was like I said, I was genuinely honored to receive the invite. You said some very nice things at the beginning. You're like, oh, he does a lot of cool stuff with his writing, blah, blah. And so I just wanted to take time to say thank you. And not just for saying that, but then also just for everything that you're doing here. I think with Elite FTS, and I mean, I've learned a ton, and I'm just one person, right? So there's like thousands and thousands and thousands of people who have had, their lives impacted pretty substantially, through your podcast, your writings, and just kind of everything you've been promoting and building. So, appreciate the offer and the opportunity to be on the podcast, but then I guess more so just extending an additional thank you to the work that you guys have been doing here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. How can people find you?
So you guys can find me.
Or let's say the best way.
Yeah, so Instagram is typically the best way. I always respond to my DMs. I get like maybe 30 to 60 a day, but I always clear them out. Sometimes it takes a little long, but I always answer every single question, whether someone's a client or not. I don't care. So Daniel _DeBrocke, my YouTube, same thing, Daniel _DeBrocke. I have a Twitter. I kind of use it, kind of don't. Same thing, Daniel _DeBrocke, and then my podcast is the Stack Strength Podcast. And then as far as what, I'm not sure if I can pitch the KEW.
You can pitch anything. Okay. Yeah.
So as far as KEW, that's Kabuki Education Week. So we have 1 week of just a ridiculous lineup. So we've got over 50 speakers going to be presenting throughout the week from February 6th to 12th. So that was an event that I was able to spearhead. So it's been a really, really cool experience just seeing how many different people are going to be there talking about everything from business to nutrition to biomechanics, injury rehabilitation, nutrition, and just behavioral psychology and all of that stuff. So we got a lot of really, really interesting speakers lined up. It's going to be an amazing event.
Now, when they sign up for that, do they get the archives too?
Yes, they do. So they'll get all the archives of the previous 3 years. So
wow.
You're getting like 150 plus hours at least of educational content. And then they're also doing CEUs for that. So we just got that approved as well. So you're going to get CEUs if you sign up for that as well. And if you can't make it, you get the recordings.
Okay.
So it's pretty cool. It's a pretty awesome event. And you can check that out at kabukistrength.com.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, we're done.